HLT.Digital is an EU Commission Erasmus Plus project involving 5 partner organisations from Slovakia, Spain, Italy, Poland, and the UK. And the project was conceived as a way of capturing some of the work that has evolved in the field of HLT over the last 5 decades, from foundational theorists and early adopters of humanistic principles in ELT, to contemporary practitioners working in fields as diverse as EdTech and leadership and management. The HLT.Digital website launched today, so it'd be great if you can go and check it out after the event. It is a work in progress, may I flag. And at the moment, it's mainly the profile resource and resources section that's available. There are 3 outputs on the digital platform. One is a gallery of HLT practitioners dating back some 50 years, as I said. And we introduce you to them through their bio, through links to publications, books, articles. There's also a media resource section where you can find videos of those practitioners giving presentations, talking about their work, being interviewed, etc., etc. And finally, a digital archive, which will share previously unpublished work by renowned HLT pioneer Mario Rindvalucri. So I hope you will have time to have a look at that, and feedback is very welcome. We do hope that the gallery of practitioners will grow. So if it's something that you would be like to be involved in, then please get in touch with me. Okay, so now on to today's event. Humanising the Coursebook, Uneasy Coexistence or Creative Partnership. I'm just going to read you Alan Paul Vanessa's introduction to the event. Whatever our beliefs about putting the student front and centre of the learning experience, about the value of emergent language and the importance of customising learning resources to meet the needs of the people in the room, it remains the case that most teachers in most teaching institutions are obliged to work with coursebooks. In a series of short talks and a closing panel discussion, today's speakers will each suggest ways in which teachers can form effective partnerships with the coursebooks, taking advantage of the consistency, security, and resources that they offer, while at the same time working creatively to resist their demotivating repetitiveness and their implicit assumptions about the learner. So we have 5 speakers for you today. Each one's going to give a 30-minute presentation, and then there will be a closing panel discussion at the end, which we hope you will all be able to stay for. Because the presentations are relatively short, there won't be time in the individual presentations for Q&A, but if you can post any questions that you have in the chat box, I will keep an eye on them, and I will throw some of those to the panelists in the closing discussion. I think that's everything. I will periodically post a Google link in the chat box. If you want a certificate of attendance, then go to that link, fill in the Google form, and we will send you one. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, who, let's face it, needs little introduction, but I'm going to tell you about him anyway. So Hugh Deller, teacher, trainer and writer based in North London. He's the co-founder of the online school and training company Lexical Lab. He has co-authored 2 multi-level general English series, Innovations and Outcomes, which is now in its 3rd edition and published by National Geographic Learning. His first methodology book, Teaching Lexically, came out in 2016. And most recently, he has worked on Grammar Nonsense, which is published by Ways Goose Press. Today, Hugh will be talking to us about concept checking questions. The title of his talk is Beyond CCQs, how to ask questions about language that engage the whole person. And he's going to look at the ways in which we can engage and challenge our students by rethinking the kinds of CCQs that we ask, or that we are asked by Coursebooks about new language that comes up in class. Over to you, Hugh.
Thank you very much. So, hello everyone. I should begin, I guess, by saying that as a coursebook writer myself, I feel slightly like I've been sort of invited into the lion's den. You know, when you're kind of talking about humanizing the coursebook, there's a sort of assumption that somehow coursebooks aren't quite human. And it's quite a strange feeling to kind of come as a writer. But luckily, I'm also a teacher and, as far as I'm aware, a human. So I'm going to be talking about kind of how all these different areas of my life sort of intersect, and just really talking through ways in which I guess I changed my own teaching practice over the years from the way I was initially trained on my CTEFLA course back in 1993. And the way in which I think questions that we ask as teachers can have a profound impact on classroom dynamics, on motivation, on the way in which students themselves respond to what's happening in the classroom, both as learners, but also as kind of whole engaged people. Okay, so that's where we're going. My basic premise is this idea, as I just said, that the questions we ask students in the classroom have a profound impact, and that impact can obviously be both positive or negative, okay? When you look at the whole issue of questions that teachers ask in classrooms, the traditional way of dividing them up or thinking about them is to talk about closed questions and more open questions. And closed questions are often these kind of questions which require a kind of fixed closed answer. So there'll be yes, no questions, true, false questions, right, wrong questions, these kinds of things. And traditionally, a lot of the reasons for asking these kinds of questions has been to get students to display knowledge. Display questions are a kind of form of closed questions, essentially, where the teacher knows the answer, the students know that the teacher knows the answer, the teacher's asking the questions so that the students can show the teacher that they also know the answer, and then everyone can move on. And I'm not saying there's necessarily a problem with those kinds of questions, but as we'll see, I think there are issues that emerge around certain forms of display questions that come up. Open questions, traditionally, are questions which you can't answer with just a yes or no, you know, despite some students' attempts to obviously try and do that on occasion. But they're usually questions which maybe you don't know the answer to. So these are kind of, you know, what did you think of it? Why did you decide to go there? How did you feel when that happened? Often kind of WH questions, I guess. That's a very general kind of overview of the way you might think about questions in the whole classroom context. When it comes to vocabulary, I think the most dominant kind of way of thinking about questions is to do with what are often called CCQs, concept checking questions. And for those, I'm guessing most of you will be familiar with the idea of CCQs, but a quick kind of overview. They're basically questions that are supposed to help us as teachers check the degree to which students understand language items. And I guess, because of the title, to check how much students understand about concepts of vocabulary, or maybe meanings of vocabulary. Interestingly, and I think problematically, we often think about CCQs as being something that we ask about grammar structures, but also about vocabulary and also about functional language and so on, okay? And I'm assuming that the reason I was taught on my CTEFLA to ask these kinds of questions is because it's an improvement on just saying, everyone got that? Everyone understand? Everyone okay with that? And, you know, having a class of shy students who don't want to lose face in front of their peers, just kind of nodding in the hope that you'll leave them alone and not bother them by asking any other questions. When you read the literature about teaching, you're often encouraged to ask these questions after you've explained new items. And there are often kind of quite elaborate rules around the way in which you're supposed to construct concept checking questions, including things like, you know, don't use the target language in the concept checking question, etc., etc. Those of you who are curious about this can find all the rules online if you want to go and Google afterwards. When you actually start looking at concept checking questions, it can be quite revealing. I've just picked 4, partly because these are questions I've asked myself in my younger, more inexperienced, naive kind of times, or they're examples I've found on various reputable English language teaching sites, which are given as recommended CCQs to ask about particular items. So the first one was from an elementary lesson where students had to match pictures to words, and they'd go through and say, number 1, jacket, number 2, boots, number 3, helmet. Good. And when I was a much younger teacher going through this exercise, I kind of thought, oh, I'd better ask some CCQs. So I would ask students, right, picture number 3. Good, it's a helmet. So do you wear it on your head or your feet? And students sort of look at me in complete bemusement, wondering why I was asking them this slightly deranged question. And the answer would often be like, well, in my country, on the head. Maybe in England it's different. We don't know. And I'd sort of think, yeah, that was a stupid question, wasn't it? So is it hard or soft? And again, students would look at you like, well, look, there's a picture of it there. Don't you know what these things are, teacher? Why are you asking us these questions? It's hard. You know, does it protect you? And again, there'd be this kind of, why are you asking us these strange questions when we've just told you picture 3 is a helmet? Other examples, getting fired, getting sacked. The questions I was told on my CELTA course to ask were, did she have a job before? Yes. And now? No. Did she want to leave? No. Did she do something wrong? Yes. Okay, good. You've got the concept of the vocabulary right. A similar one that came up in another exercise I saw recently. He got kicked out of the team. Was he in the team before? Is he in the team now? Did he want to leave the team? And recognize, as in I didn't recognize her. Did I already know her? Did I know it was her when I saw her? You know, yes and no. Okay. I'm guessing these kinds of closed display concept checking questions for vocabulary are probably quite familiar to many of you out there. And, oh, excuse me, I think there are issues with them, okay? And I think the first issue is they work well with grammar. If you've got something like the present perfect simple and you're asking, did it happen in the past, present, or future? Past. Do we know when in the past? No. Well, that's the concept of the present perfect simple. I think with vocabulary, they work much less well, partly because I think it's not necessarily concepts or meanings that are the main issue with vocabulary. The main issue is, what do you do with the words that you've just studied? And if you've got a picture of a helmet, or you've just explained what get fired means, or students have translated what get fired or get kicked out of something means, these questions are kind of redundant. And I know from my own earlier experience and from watching students, from trainee teachers teach, that often students will ask what a word means, and the teacher will immediately, rather than explaining what the word means, concept check it with the students. So students will say things like, you know, teacher, what does recognize mean? And the teachers will kind of go, well, did I know this person before? And the students look at you and sort of think, listen, if I knew the answer to these questions, I wouldn't have asked you what the word means. Why are you asking me? I asked you. You're the teacher. You do the explaining. Come on, help me out here. So I think sometimes there's a temptation to fall back on these questions at the expense of explaining. And maybe sometimes for teachers, you've been made to feel guilty about explaining things. You think, oh, maybe I'm doing a bit too much teacher talking time when I'm explaining. Maybe I'm hogging the stage a little bit. Maybe I should let the students kind of teach themselves or teach me. I think a bigger problem is they don't actually really clarify meaning, okay? So if you go back to the idea of she got fired from her job. Well, okay, they clarify that she had a job before, she doesn't have a job now, she didn't want to leave, and maybe she did something wrong. That doesn't really tell you exactly how that's different from being made redundant, for example, okay? Or the one about being kicked out of the team. Well, he left the team, he didn't want to leave the team. You get a vague idea of what it means, but you're not really clear on the contexts in which you might use it, what you might say about it, how the word works in wider kind of discourse. And I think maybe the biggest problem, particularly in terms of humanizing course books, is they're kind of a bit patronizing, these questions. If you've seen a picture of a helmet and you know that the helmet is number 3, and someone's asking you where you wear it, it's like, well, do you think I'm an idiot? Do you think we don't have helmets in my country? Do you think I've never seen these things before? Do you think I don't understand what they're for? You know, we have helmets, we wear them on our motorbikes in countries X, Y, and Z. I think sometimes they can actually be confusing because students just look at you and think, why are you asking me if it's hard or soft? What kind of crazy question is this? Is it a trick? Are you trying to trap me here? And I think particularly they don't engage students in a whole way in as much as other questions that we're going to look at might do, okay? So I think there's this problem with just getting students to give you yes, no answers that don't go very far in the class and don't engage or involve students and don't allow students to bring in their real world knowledge. So I'm going to suggest a kind of alternative way forward that teachers can use, to be honest, whether you're using course books or not, okay? But it's basically just a way of thinking about dealing with new language that emerges. It could be vocabulary that students ask you about that comes up from a text in a course book. It could be something that you're doing as you're going through the answers to a course book exercise, and you just want to check and explore and push a little bit and engage the students a bit more. And basically, it's what I've called the triple X rule, okay? Where you explain the meaning of the item in the context you encounter it. You give an example of how it might be used, an example that's quite similar to the example students have already seen it in. And then the kind of magic part, I think, is you use the class to expand upon the example. And we'll look at how you can do this. So if you go back to the helmet, what you might do is just write a quick example up on the board while students are doing the exercise. You might think 3 or 4 of my students didn't know this word helmet. I'll just write an example. Hey, if you're going out on your bike, make sure you wear a helmet. Any of you who have children will have had this conversation repeatedly. Then, as I'm going through and saying, right, picture 3, this is the helmet. Yeah, okay. So, you know, if you're going out on your bike, you may have to wear a helmet. When else might you need to wear a helmet? Well, I kind of know the answers to those questions, like, you know, if you're working on a building site, if you're going skateboarding, if you're on a motorbike. Sometimes students come up with weird answers. I had a student recently who said, what's the thing where you roll down the hill inside the big plastic ball? Not Zumba. I can't remember the name of it.
Zorb, I think.
Zorbing, thank you. Zorbing. I had this Brazilian woman in my group who said, when you are zorbing, and I was like, I have no idea what zorbing is. And she had a film of her inside a plastic ball. It's like some kind of nightmare for me. It's like you're trapped in a plastic ball, which you hold onto the side of with a helmet on, and you roll down a hill. Okay. And you have to wear a helmet in case you fall over and bash your head. So I came home having learned all about zorbing. The student got to share this part of her life and her reality with the group. What else might you wear as well as a helmet? Well, it depends where you are. If you're skateboarding, you might wear elbow pads or knee pads. If you're on a building site, you might wear a kind of, yellow vest or a yellow protective, yellow reflective jacket or something. When might you say, luckily, I was wearing a helmet? Well, to answer that question, you have to kind of tell a whole story, yeah? And, as an elementary student, you may make mistakes, you may not know vocabulary. As a teacher, I can help you tell that story. And, it's more engaging, more involving than saying, does it protect you? Yes. Then later, when you're practicing it yourself, and you might say, have you ever been in a situation where luckily you were wearing a helmet? Students can tell these kind of stories about their own lives, and you've paved the way towards that a little bit. In the same way, she got fired from her last job. You might write an example. He got fired from his last job for being late all the time. And you can then ask the group, any other reasons why you might get fired? Why else might you get fired? Get kicked out of the team. You can write another example up. She got kicked out of the school team. Sorry, not teach. That's a typo. For constantly arguing with the coach. And again, you can ask, why else might you be kicked out of a team? Anywhere else you can be kicked out of? Who by? Why? Okay. And obviously, all of these questions explore the language a lot more and involve the students a lot more. We'll look at what happens sometimes in a minute when you ask these questions. I didn't recognize her. I didn't recognize him. He'd lost so much weight. Any other reasons why you might not recognize someone? And again, work from students' ideas. So these kind of questions, they're not exactly traditional concept checking questions. I think they're better questions because what happens is stories emerge when you're asking students. Students are much more engaged. The questions allow the students to connect the language to their own life experience, their own worlds, their own stories. And often what happens is you ask the group, any other reasons why you get fired, for example. They understand the idea, but maybe they don't know the English. So if you're in a monolingual classroom, they might say the answer in their own first language. I think that's fine. You just go, yeah, I know what you mean. Does anyone know how to say that in English? And you teach it. In my classes, often people will just say it in kind of pidgin English or broken English or intermediate English or whatever. So they'll say things like, yeah, how to say not can do job. And you go, yeah, okay. So he got fired from his last job for being incompetent. Any other reasons? They might say things like, how to say boss. You go, yeah, okay. Punching your boss. Is this something you've done, Tsuyoshi? I wish. Okay, right. Well, don't try it at work, Tsuyoshi, because you'll lose your job, mate. Any other reasons? I once asked this, and one of my students, a young Italian lad who thought he was God's gift to women, shouted out, sleeping with the boss's wife. Okay. You're like, oh, yeah, okay. I wasn't expecting that answer. Then one of the older Chinese students in my class shouted out, oh, you wish, just dream, Luigi, dream, dream. Just little boy dream, puh, puh. Then another student said, sleeping with boss's wife or husband, not problem. Problem, boss knows. And you're like, oh, actually, that's true. Yeah. So let me change that one. I'll cross that out. I'll write, he got fired from his last job after getting caught. Sleeping with the boss's wife or husband, could go either way. Okay. Any other things you might get caught doing that mean you get fired from your last job? One of my students said very specifically, drinking vodka in toilets. Well, I think just generally drinking at work. No, vodka in toilets. Okay, anyone you know? Not me, friend of mine. Okay, so a friend of yours that definitely wasn't you got fired from a job after getting caught drinking vodka in the toilets. Any other reasons? Stealing money from the till. And while this is happening, I'm working with the students' ideas. I'm checking I understand them. Students are commenting on each other's ideas. I'm changing my examples in response to what's coming up with the group. There's a lot of laughter. There's a lot of kind of interaction and banter and joking. And what we end up with on the board was this, okay? This is taking one sentence from a course book and kind of transforming it by using the students to expand upon the examples and add to where we're going. And I think these kinds of questions are much, much better to be asking for several reasons. They leave a lot more space for the students than just the closed yes/no questions. And another typo, I'm sorry. You kind of know the answers that you expect, okay? But you're often surprised, which is surprised. It's us. Oh, sorry. Next time, remind me to spell check my own presentations. A note to any young presenters out there. When you ask questions like, any other reasons why you might get fired, you think you know the answers, but students often surprise you. I asked a group once, I explained the idea of passing out, like you pass out on the underground because it's so hot. And I asked the class any other reasons why you might pass out. Someone said low blood sugar, okay? Someone else said you haven't eaten all day and it's very hot. Another student said Justin Bieber. It's like, any other reasons why you pass out? Justin Bieber. That wasn't an answer I was expecting. I need a bit more context here. Student had this whole story about how Justin Bieber had played in Korea for the first time, and she was a huge teenage believer, like a Justin Bieber fan. And she went along to the concert and there was a crush at the front and she kind of got crushed and she passed out and they took her to the medical room. And by the time she came round, she'd missed the whole concert. And that was a really great story because she wouldn't have volunteered that story under normal circumstances, I don't think. If I'd said, have any of you ever passed out at a pop concert? I mean, why would I even have thought of this question? It's a really random thing to ask someone. By asking the question about any other reasons why you pass out, it allows the opportunity for students to give personal stories if they want to, getting caught drinking vodka in the toilets, passing out at a Justin Bieber concert. And they're still checking understanding. If you ask any other reasons why maybe you don't recognize someone, well, to answer that question, you have to understand the word recognize. So as a teacher, I can tell from the responses whether students understood the word or not. They're more involving. They bring the students' worlds, their cultures, their stories, their experiences, their own realities, their own national kind of experiences to the classroom in a way that the course book on its own, I don't think can. And as a teacher, they allow you to kind of co-construct further examples using all of that wealth that the students bring to the class. The examples that you're giving don't just show the meaning, they show something about the context in which you might use the language, they show something about the language you might use with the language you're teaching. There's also a kind of recycling element to what's going on. So in these extra examples, you're kind of secretly teaching grammar, or you're secretly recycling grammar and recycling vocabulary. And I think the other way in which it's a much more human kind of way of doing things is it gives students the chance to learn as much or as little as they want to. If you're just writing, you know, recognize verb on the board, or kicked out of phrasal verb on the board, well, for the strong students, where's the challenge? If what you're writing is something like this, students will remember from this what they feel is important for them. For my Japanese student, Tsuyoshi, what he wanted to take away from this was got fired from his job for punching his boss, because this was clearly something that had been on his mind for some time. With some of the other students, they may remember all of it. They may read the examples in 2 years' time and think, I remember that conversation in that classroom. Because by doing these kinds of questions and asking these kinds of questions, you're rooting the language from the course book much more in the reality of the particular group and the reality of the students. And every time you teach that page and every time you ask these questions, the interaction will be different. So even though, you know, on one level, you're stuck by the restraints of the course book and you're repeating the material, through asking engaging interactive questions, you're allowing this degree of unpredictability and personalization and localization to come into the classroom. And these kind of questions are different to CCQs. They usually include the keyword in the questions, you know, any other reasons why you didn't recognize anybody, anything you might get kicked out of. They're impersonal. I'm not asking you, have you ever been kicked out of anywhere? You know, things like that. They're based on kind of might or probability. They allow you to explore what it means to know the word. They're quite open. They allow you to look at the connected language, you know, any other reasons why you might be arrested, anything you might be charged with if you are arrested. So you get to all of that connected language. As I said, they often have unexpected answers, you know, things you weren't expecting. And as a teacher, they give you feedback on how much the students can already do, which allows you to build on that and work from where the students are at and extend their learning. You might be thinking, oh, sounds quite difficult, but actually anyone can ask these kinds of questions. There's no copyright on them. I don't own these ideas. You're free to screenshot this and start asking these questions yourself. And it's basically just things like, why might people do X? What do you have to do if you want to X? How does Xing usually end? What other things can you X? What's the opposite of Xing in this context? What do people do if they're Y? What might you say if you were Y with someone? What might you ask if it's why in a room? What prepositions do you get after why? What kind of places might you describe as why? And there's not many more kinds of questions that you ask actually like that. Once you've kind of internalized these and made them part of your repertoire, you can ask them about whatever verbs or adjectives you're looking at. And the delight is it'll be different every time. And as a teacher, you may feel, okay, I'm stuck with the course book, I'm working through it, but I know how to make little bits of different magic happen and how to bring all of my students to the classroom as I'm doing it by asking much better questions about the language I'm looking at. I'm very conscious of the fact I'm bang on my half an hour. So I'm just going to stop by saying, if you're on Instagram, please follow us. We're lexical_lab. Please check out the website for what we do. And if anyone wants to email and get in touch for any reason, it's hugh@lexicallab.com. Enjoy the rest of the presentations, and I'll see you back later at 4:10. Thank you very much to Sarah and Alan for inviting me, and thank you for watching and for your time.
Thank you, Hugh, for a thought-provoking and entertaining talk as always. I noticed from the comments in the chat box that our Cuba contingent is here.
Hey.
So welcome, Eduardo and Isora.
Hey, hello,
And
hello.
some of your ideas may well be appearing in Cuba soon.
They've been there already.
Ah,
But, you know,
okay,
good to go
so
over it again.
if anybody, we've got a few minutes. If anybody has any questions for Hugh, feel free to go ahead. Our next speaker is from Cameroon, and she's having some connection problems. So,
Thank you.
and
Looking forward to that as well. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please feel free just to stick them in the box. Thank you, Essence.
Alan, can you see Eno here now? Eno, if you're here, make yourself known, please.
I don't, I think
don't
she's
think...
dropped out again.
Yeah. Okay, you know what's coming next, don't you? Would Kath or Alan be prepared to stand in and be up next? Are you happy to do that? That's great. Thank you very much, Kath. Okay, so slight change to the programme in ordering. Our next speaker will be Catherine Stannard. So Catherine is an author and editor based in the UK. She's taught English to a wide variety of students in many different settings and is the co-author of several successful secondary series for Pearson, Macmillan and National Geographic Learning, as well as raps, songs and magazine articles. She gives plenaries and workshops around the world and also conducts webinars from her home office in the UK. Kath is passionate about using real-world materials to help children develop their social and emotional skills and global competence within a supportive and holistic framework. So today, the title of Kath's talk is Using the Coursebook to Foster Social and Emotional Skills. So Kath's going to talk about what social and emotional skills are, why there is an increasing need for our students to focus on these skills, and using coursebook examples, discuss how we can use coursebooks to promote these skills. Over to you, Kath.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So let me have a go at sharing my screen to start with. All right. Can you all see that? Is that working?
Yes, that's fine.
Yep. Okay. Excellent. Good. Can you see? Sorry. I'm not on my normal, sadly, I'm not on my normal computer because my Wi-Fi's gone down. So there, is that better? Yep.
That's great. Yeah.
Great. Okay, good. So, and since I'm not going at the normal time, Sarah or Alan, if you can just give me a warning if I'm looking like I'm going over, because I'm not sure now what time I'm supposed to stop. So I just don't let me go over. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So yes, I want to talk about using the coursebook to foster social and emotional learning. I'll just give you a quick agenda. This is what I'm going to talk about. What is social and emotional learning? I'll just introduce you to the term if you don't already know it. Why do I think it's really important now? And then we'll get down to the nitty-gritty of some good practical activities that I hope you could take away and use in your classrooms, or if you're developing course books, use in course books. So I'm very into storytelling, and I always like to use stories to try and introduce topics. And I have an anecdote for you, which is very relevant to social and emotional learning, which I thought we'd just start off with. This is a true story about my daughter, who started secondary school at the age of 11. She went from a very small village school to a big school, secondary school with 1,500 students. So it's quite a big deal. And 2 weeks into the beginning of her school term, the head teacher called all of these first year students into the hall, a hall a bit like that, to give them a pep talk, to tell them about how brilliantly they were doing. So there they were, 300 students. And he said, "You've been here for 2 weeks now, and it already feels as if you're part of the..." And she thought, what's he going to say? Maybe he's going to say part of the family. Sadly, he didn't. He said furniture. And she came back deeply demoralized and upset at the thought that actually she was just now already part of the furniture. But I think it does quite well sum up some of the problems that we have when we teach large numbers of kids or people generally in classrooms, is that we start to think of them as part of the furniture. And of course, they're not. They're all individuals. They're not lockers into which you can shove information. They're not chairs that you can stack. They're humans. And that's why humanizing the course book is so important. And it's important to give our young learners and growing learners the social and emotional skills so that they can operate as humans in society rather than as just containers of information. So what is social and emotional learning? Let's go on to the first part of this. I've got a definition here for you from CASEL. So if you're not aware of what CASEL is, it's the Collaborative for Academic and Social and Emotional Learning. It was set up in the mid-1990s. It's based in the United States, and it's a very, very useful resource if you want to find out generally about social and emotional learning and why it's important and what it can involve. So CASEL came up with this definition. The social and emotional learning is the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, to manage emotions, to achieve personal and collective goals, to feel and show empathy for others, to establish and maintain supportive relationships, and to make responsible and caring decisions. So I would, in my head, I sum that up as social and emotional learning are the skills that you need to work in society, to sort of get on with other people, and to understand your place in society. And social and emotional skills, or social and emotional learning, is one term that's used. You can also talk about life skills or soft skills or non-academic skills, but social and emotional learning, or SEL, is the term that's commonly used at the moment. And this is a handy little model that CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic and Social and Emotional Learning, built just to show the sort of 5 key areas that make up social and emotional learning. And I'm going to go through each of these very briefly, because this isn't, I really want to move on to the practical stuff, but I think it's good to know exactly what we're aiming for before I go on to that. So you can see there are 5 areas. I tend to think that you start with the blue section, you start with the self-awareness, and I think that generally happens anyway as you see very small children growing, that they start with an awareness of themselves. You can see it when babies sort of suddenly realize the hand is actually attached to the arm, and then that they can actually do something with it. Self-awareness, that moves on to self-management. And once you've sort of become aware and you're managing yourself, then you can move on to being socially aware, to developing relationship skills. And all of that kind of comes together to make a person into someone who can be a responsible decision maker. You can't make responsible decisions until you understand yourself and you understand the impacts that you have on other people. That's very much my interpretation. So I tend to see it more as a kind of, Maslow style pyramid rather than a circle, but the CASEL model is a circle. So let's look at each of those very quickly. So we'll start with self-awareness. The self-awareness is things like identifying your own emotions, having a growth mindset, examining your prejudices. So you can see it with children when they have a very strong emotion, but they actually find it difficult to understand what that emotion is. And in fact, as adults, I think we definitely can have that as well. If you're feeling very stressed about something, but you express that through being very angry and you're not sure exactly what that emotion is. So developing the skill to identify the emotion that you're feeling, that's part of self-awareness. I'm sure you're very aware of having a growth mindset. So that is really understanding that you're not fixed in your abilities, that you're able to grow and to improve. So that's self-awareness. The next section in that circular model is called self-management. So Now you can identify that you're feeling stressed and that's what's making you feel angry. Perhaps you can start to manage that. So you can start to use some stress management strategies. You can exercise self-discipline, and you can demonstrate personal and collective agency, which means that you understand that you can actually have an effect on the things that you do. You're not just waiting for other people to do things for you. So that all falls into the area of self-management. And now moving on, so once you've sort of understood yourself and how to manage yourself, you can look outside that and become aware of society around you. And that's where you're doing things like demonstrating empathy, showing concern for others, identifying diverse norms, which sounds very sophisticated, but I mean, for a young child, that can be as simple as understanding that you have your tea at 5 o'clock, but someone else has their tea at 6 o'clock, or you visit your grandma on a Saturday, but someone else does something different. So it doesn't necessarily need to be terribly sophisticated. It's just understanding that people in different places, or even people in different households or people in different families, have different ways of living. And linked into that is taking others' perspectives. Now you're aware of society, you're aware of the people around you, but you also have to develop those relationship skills so that you can get on with them. So you communicate effectively, you demonstrate cultural competency. So you understand that there are different cultures and you behave in a way that doesn't cause offense or shows that you understand other people. And you show leadership and practice teamwork. And those are two things I think we do a lot in the classroom anyway. When we ask students to work in groups or pairs, they're all the time, they're practicing their leadership and their teamwork skills. And those are very important skills just generally in life. Now, as I said, my personal interpretation is that all of those kind of 4 sections go together to make us into responsible decision makers. And those are people who work in society by demonstrating curiosity and open-mindedness. They're critical thinkers, they can find solutions to problems, and they understand that their actions, or we understand that our actions, have consequences. So that is a dash through the 5 key areas that make up social and emotional learning. So I hope now, if someone says to you, what social and emotional learning, you have a little idea of it. As I said, I use storytelling an awful lot to help me understand things and remember things. So when I was doing my own research into this and finding out about it, I found the easiest way to get my head around it was to make up a little story. So here's my social and emotional learning short story. It can start off with a student being self-aware enough to understand that they feel an emotion of anxiety. I feel anxious about the test next week. So there they are, they're demonstrating self-awareness. Let's move on to self-management. I feel anxious, so I'm going to go for a walk and try to calm down. So now they've demonstrated two skills from the 2 areas. Now they're looking around. My friend is very quiet today. Maybe they also feel anxious about the test. That moves on to relationship skills. So I'm going to talk to my friend and I'm going to show some support for them. And then finally, responsible decision making. My friend and I have decided to do some revision together this afternoon. So you can see how we use all those skills in just a very, very simple scenario. But those are all very useful skills to know and to have. So I hope that has given you a very quick, brief overview of social and emotional learning. And as I said, if you want to find out more about it, check out the Castle website. And maybe a bit later, I might put the link into the chat box if that's okay. So it might be useful for people to have a look at that. So why is it so important now? I think there's such an obvious answer to this. There's such a, it'll be interesting to get your perspectives, but unfortunately we don't have time. But I feel there is a bit of a looming crisis, mental health crisis, particularly with young people post-pandemic. And I think what we've seen is the pandemic showed that there were some people who just couldn't cope with some of the situations they were in. And I think as educators, we've often really focused on What are we going to do about the kids who don't have computers? What are we going to do about the kids who don't have Wi-Fi, who don't have space at home, who don't have supportive parents? But actually, maybe we didn't have enough of a spotlight on what are we going to do about the kids who just mentally are not in a place, who don't have those skills, those social skills to deal with being in the pandemic situation. And those were the kids that really suffered. And the pandemic highlighted that. So it was the kids who didn't have resilience, who didn't have an independence, who didn't have critical thinking skills, who really struggled once they were away from the classroom. And that's why I think it's really important now, post-pandemic, to try and focus on improving the way that we teach so that we bring those skills out. So there's an increasing concern about young people's mental health. The pandemic disrupted learning and highlighted inequities around well-being. And the other key thing is that anxiety and stress affects academic performance. So if you're listening to me and you're thinking, well, that's all great, but actually, you know, I've still got to get my students through their exams at the end of the year, and I've got to tick the boxes from my school, and we have to achieve certain things. Well, there are all sorts of surveys and research that's been done that shows that students with well-developed social and emotional skills perform better academically. And in fact, you can go on to say they have much better, longer, long-term outcomes. So I will just show you, I don't know if you can see that on the slide, there are a couple of bits of research that have gone into that in more detail. So this one from Ariel Lindorf, the impact of promoting student well-being on student academic and non-academic outcomes, and the OECD, the results in focus from their PISA survey, again showed that students with well-developed social and emotional skills make a smoother transition between primary and secondary. They're more engaged, they're less likely to drop out, they're more successful academically, and they have better long-term outcomes. So we can see that it's really important to try and embed social and emotional skills into our teaching practice. So how are we doing that? And that comes to the third part of my talk. And as I can't seem to see a clock, could Sarah or Alan tell me how I'm doing time-wise?
Doing very well. You're just halfway.
Yeah, you've got
Perfect.
15 minutes left.
Okay, perfect, good. Right, this is the important stuff now. How can we foster social and emotional learning in our classrooms? So I want to show you some examples from books. Now, these books are all books that I have been involved in and I've written or written at other levels, but I'm not trying to tell you that you need to buy these books. That's not the point. I'm just using them because I know the books really well. You could use any course book and you could find material in those course books that you can use to foster social and emotional learning. So let's have a look at one of them. This is using content. So this is a text from New Close-Up, which is published by National Geographic Learning, and it's a text all about the good gym. And you can start off straight away by asking your students what emotion those people are feeling. So straight away, you can do something that gets your students understanding how to identify emotion. And they most likely will say, these people look very happy and they look like they're enjoying themselves. So they're identifying an emotion. Why do you think they're enjoying themselves? Maybe it's because they're running. So there's a strategy that you can use to manage your emotions. Perhaps physical activity can help you to enjoy yourself. So just using a picture to introduce a subject, you can straight away get into that development of some social and emotional skills. Now, the text itself is all about how you can help other people. So the Good Gym, which is a scheme, I don't know if it's international or just in the UK, but the idea is that it's a community of runners, but instead of running on their own in the gym, they want to exercise and help people at the same time. So sometimes they will go and clear a litter somewhere, they'll go and help with a community project, they'll look after a school garden. Sometimes they run and visit older people, and then they talk about the older people as their coaches. So they'll run to an older person's house, stop for a cup of tea, have a little chat, and then get some advice from the older people, and then they go back home again. So it's a very nice example of a way that people can demonstrate empathy They can identify solutions to problems. So if you look at the bottom right-hand corner of the slides that I'm going to show you over the next 15 minutes, you see that I've flagged up the social and emotional skill that these kind of activities can develop. So this one is demonstrating empathy, which is social awareness or relationship skills, and identifying solutions to problems, which is being a responsible decision maker. So just in choosing your texts and mining those texts and sort of trying to get the message out of them is a great way of developing social and emotional skills. And, you know, time was maybe 10 years ago, I think course books were a lot less interesting and had far less real world content. But it's great to see nowadays the new course book that I've been seeing coming out from every one of the big publishers have far more real world material, and that makes it much easier to mine them for useful things that you can use to develop your students' social and emotional skills. So you can then pull out a discussion from that. So once you've done the work in the course book that is probably focusing on comprehension and reading skills, you can then move on to a discussion like, do you think you would enjoy being a runner at the Good Gym? Why or why not? Think about some projects in your community that the Good Gym could help, or imagine you want to set up a local Good Gym group and design something to promote that. So those are all discussion things that can just bring out that idea of the social and emotional skills that are demonstrating empathy, identifying solutions to problems. Okay. Now, I've also said that there are things that you can do outside of the book. So I think it's very nice to find things that you can do in the classroom that relate to what's in the course book, but humanize it even more. So once you've discussed, I suggested at the beginning of this that you discuss the emotions that those runners are showing, and you talk about why maybe they're showing those emotions. You could then perhaps set up a classroom emotions wall in your classroom. So you can elicit some different words for emotions, stick them up just like that, either on a real classroom emotions wall, or you can have one online if you're teaching online. And then you can demonstrate it at the beginning of, say, once or twice a week. You can go over to the classroom emotions wall, and as the teacher, you demonstrate your ability to identify your own emotions. It's very important that you are a role model. So you can say, well, today I feel embarrassed because I walked into a lamppost on my way to school. Or today I feel excited because I'm going to meet an old friend tonight. And then you go around and you ask several students in the class. So that becomes something that's very normal for them to do and not scary, because they can see the example of you doing it and they can see others doing it, and they learn to identify their emotions and understand the reasons for their emotions. And then you could maybe go on to do an activity like this, where you can create a self-help mind map. And you can talk about, again, the Good Gym, if that's the text that you've used. And they say, well, perhaps some of those runners go for a run because it's a way of dealing with their anxiety. When I feel anxious, I can go for a walk. What can you do? And then your students can work individually or in pairs and make their own self-help mind map, where they can talk about different techniques and strategies that they can use to manage their own emotions. And that's a very useful tool to have. And you can see down there in the SEL flag, I've put manage your emotions. All right, so that's one way that you can see we've started off with the course book. We've got as much as we can out of it in terms of the social and emotional learning, and then we've continued to create our own materials that can do some, maybe even more, and be useful materials for students to refer to. Let's have another look at an example from a book. So this is from, I will tell you after the next slide because I can't remember, but I think it's from Impact. Now, I wonder if I can get the chat up. If anyone knows what this is showing. Does anyone have any idea why these people are holding blue bags and where they are? You can use your critical thinking skills to guess where they are, because a lot of them are wearing very similar tops. So if you've got any ideas, put some ideas in the chat box, but I'm not going to give you much time. Football match, exactly. They're at a football match. Do you know why they're all carrying blue plastic bags? Any ideas? Yes, picking litter, exactly, picking litter post-match. So this photo comes from the 2014, I think, World Cup in Brazil. And it was the Japanese football fans, and they became very well known for it, and are still very well known for it, that whenever they go to a big international football match, they bring their bags, they wave them around, they're blue to show support for their team, and at the end of the match, they pick all the litter. So it's a fantastic real life example of taking responsibility for your actions. Yeah, so this is from level 4 of impact. So it's a great way, as I say, evaluating the consequence of your actions, demonstrating collective agency. So that's just one way that you can use a photograph. That's quite an interesting topic. In the book, it's used to introduce a whole topic of sport and the environmental impacts of sport. But it's also something that you can do to get your students thinking about generally the consequences of actions and collective agency. So how can we go on from that to produce our own materials? Well, one thing that we talk about is agency. And I think particularly dealing with teenagers, but everyone really, there is that feeling that you don't actually have control. There are a lot of things you don't have control over. So an interesting exercise to do with your students that you could pull out of something like this is to make a circle of control. And that's where you ask your students to think about what things in their lives they can't control and what they can control. So for example, I can't control pollution. Okay, I could get very upset about that and very wound up and very worried, but I can control to help clean up a local place. So it's a way of getting your students to realize that they can have actions, or they can take actions with consequences, and they can have some kind of agency, personal agency. So then you can ask them to work together and populate their circles of control with things that they can't control and things that they can control. So you can't control the weather, but you can control your decision to take an umbrella out with you. You can't control what other people say about you, but you can control how you respond to that. So that's a very useful activity for students to do. All right, I think I've got one more idea. And this is about using role models. And again, I think this is, again, an improvement, I would say, to the course book that I've seen over the years. And I can tell you why this course books have changed as a writer, because when we used to use celebrities a lot more, it inevitably then happened that that celebrity would do something absolutely appalling. And it would be very embarrassing because it would be in your course book, disseminated around the world. And yet that particular celebrity, and there are plenty you can think of, has now become someone that you don't really want to talk about. So as writers in the publishing world, we then started to remove the celebrities from the course books and try to use kind of role models who aren't perhaps as rich and famous and beautiful and talented, but are real life role models. So I think that's a very interesting thing to look for in course books and to pull out. So this is an interesting activity to do if you have a good picture of a role model and you want to get your students thinking about who that role model might be. And you can work on using role models to challenge preconceived ideas. So I've done this in various talks. I've done this with students. You start off with a very small picture like that, and you can ask students, or I could ask you now if you have time, if we're going to introduce a new subject to the class and you see this picture, what do you think the subject's going to be? What are we going to talk about? So I want you to think about what that picture says to you, and what do you think the topic might be that we're going to talk about? So I don't know if you've got a minute or two to think about that. God, Okay, so you see a religious element, you see that as the typical bearded god type. Any other ideas about what that picture might represent? Old person, yeah. Appearance, character, yeah. Respect. So the first thing that you're seeing there is age. My students would just say old people, right? So other answers that I've had at this stage, the rise of beard care wellness, that's excellent. Other things that students might say could be homelessness. So I've often had that given as an answer because the beard looks a little bit unkempt. So you might say homelessness. Okay, so then you expand the picture, hopefully. Except, let's just see. There we are. Right, there we are. We're expanding our picture. Now, do you want to change your mind? What do you think it's about now? Spiritualism? Any other ideas now that you've seen he's wearing a turban? Wisdom, religion, war. Okay, interesting. So again, those are the kind of responses that I usually get. Sometimes, sadly, people will say terrorism. So they make assumptions based on what they're seeing, which is what we all do all of the time. But then you can expand it a bit further. And you can see what there is written on his shirt. And it says marathon winner over 90s. So actually, this is about sport. This is fit for life. It's introducing a unit being fit for life. And it's the picture of a 102-year-old marathon runner, Fauja Singh, and apologies if I pronounced his name incorrectly. So that is a really nice little activity to do to get your students just thinking about their preconceived ideas and their prejudices, examining their prejudices, which is, again, one of those social and emotional learning descriptors, and just sort of rethinking the original thoughts that you have about things and turning them around a little bit. Okay, so I think I'm pretty much at the end. That's right. So one more activity that you can pull out of that, having got your students to maybe read about this amazing marathon runner and to think about how he achieved that and how he got his goals, is you could then ask your students to make their own vision board, to think about their own future, which gives them a sense of agency. So I made my 2023 vision board, so that's my personal one. And what I do is I put in all the things that I want to do, and then I will set myself some targets. So I've put to myself, okay, I want to make music. So that means I'm going to practice the piano 3 times a week. Or I want to share food with friends. Okay, I'm actually going to invite some people around rather than just thinking it would be a nice thing to do. So they can make their own vision board, and it's something they can do at home as a project, or they can do it in school. And if it's an online vision board rather than an actual material one, then they can also include things like videos and links to websites and stuff like that to help them visualize their future, and then think about activities that you can do now to make that future happen. And there again, there's the link to the social and emotional learning descriptor demonstrating collective and personal agency, curiosity, and open-mindedness. Okay, so I hope some of those ideas were useful. I hope it showed some ways that we can humanize the course book and bring some social and emotional learning into the classroom. So thank you so much for listening to me. And I've no idea if I got the timing right, but
Perfect.
Thanks.
Perfect.
Good.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Kath. That was wonderful. And I'm a great cutter and sticker, so I'm going to rush off after we finish and make a vision board. I'm really liking that idea. Great. So moving on, delighted that Inau from Cameroon has managed to reconnect. Inau, could you open your camera and your mic, please?
My camera is on. You can see me?
Ah, right ahead of me. Great, okay. And do you have a PPT to share?
Yes, I do. I'm so sorry for for coming late. I had serious connectivity
No,
issues.
that's okay. It must be very frustrating for you. It's not a problem.
Can you see my screen?
No,
Not yet.
not yet. No.
Okay. Having serious issues with connection. I just hope it goes
That's it.
back.
Oh, we've got something. Yeah, we've got something coming.
Okay. Please,
Yeah.
do you have a clear vision of my screen?
We can see it now, but it's not in presentation mode.
Okay. Oh my God. Oh my God.
That's okay. If you go to slideshow in the toolbar at the top.
Up in the red banner in our and to the left.
And to the left.
That's
Slide.
just gone past it. So up a bit, up a bit. Up in the
Oh.
yeah, up again into the red banner. That's right. And now to your right. And again to the right. That's it. That one there. Yeah. So if you click on that. And then to the far left in the grey panel where it says from beginning. Just be a bit slow. There we go. Perfect.
Okay. So
Okay, take a breath and I'm going to introduce you now. So our next speaker is Inal Njang Are Ibo, an ESL and EFL teacher from Cameroon. She holds a BA in English and a professional diploma in English from the Higher Teacher Training College in Yaoundé. She's been teaching for over 7 years and is a member of the English Connect Sub-Saharan Teachers Community Forum. She is passionate about professional development and willing to learn and connect with other teachers. And the title of Inal's talk is Humanising the Coursebook, Empowering Learners Through a Competency-Based Language Teaching Approach. And the talk will focus on the fact that in 2013 in Cameroon, the competency-based approach to language teaching and learning was introduced, replacing the previous objective-based approach. This approach recognises that every learner possesses a diverse set of skills, experiences, and aspirations. And now we'll talk about how competency-based coursebooks can be humanised. Over to you, Inal.
thank you very much. Thank you for all being patient and giving me this opportunity to share with you all the little knowledge I have on Coursebook humanization. Thank you all very much. So I'm going to be giving you a brief background of what competency-based approach is. It is actually a language approach that puts the learners at the forefront. It focuses on how to use language skills to perform real life competencies. So I'm going to be presenting to you what competency-based approach is all about and how to actually use, because it is an approach we use actually right now in my country. So I cannot talk about humanizing a Coursebook without bringing competency-based approach into the play. So I'm going to move to my first slide right here. All right, so the structure of a CBA Coursebook is that the lessons are integrated in real life context. For example, you have a domain of life, family, and social life. You have a module using language to talk about social integration, traditions, customs of Cameroon, and conflict resolution. Lessons have clearly stated expected outcomes, that is, competencies that should be acquired by the end of the lesson. Lessons take into consideration the incorporation of humanist values, what the term attitudes, like sociability, responsibility, team building, collaboration, etc. As you can see, this is a screenshot, I don't know if it is visible, of how the Coursebook, like the front page of each module, looks like. Then next, I'll take you to the shortcomings of the Coursebook. The Coursebook is written for everyone, so it does not provide ways of tailoring the lesson to suit particular needs of students. In other words, it does not provide possibilities for differentiation. Another shortcoming is that the new teacher using the Coursebook will actually have difficulties. The Coursebook also mentions attitudes which could be alluded to humanist values, but does not provide ways of integrating them in the lessons and how learners can self-evaluate these values at the end of each lesson. So I'm going to take you to the next slide, which is the objective of this presentation. Through different methods of adaptation, this presentation seeks to show how learners can use language to acquire competencies in real-life context. The talk also aims to present ways of integrating humanist values into a competence-based lesson. So we have expected outcomes like learners should be able to use language. For example, we'll be talking about language points like the second conditioner. If you were to, what were you? Modals like should or could, to talk about promoting peace and resolving conflicts. Learners should also be able to apply values such as empathy and emotional intelligence to resolve conflicts. Learners should be able to complete a self-assessment form on the acquisition of both language skills and humanist values. So that said, I'll take you to a lesson. This is actually an existing material that is found in the Coursebook. It is actually talking about the United Nations organization and the articles they came up with concerning peaceful resolution of conflicts. This material is actually relevant, but how do I make this material here touch the lives of my students particularly? If we read a text like this, how would the students integrate this passage into their lives? So I thought this passage is relevant, but I need to make it actually touch the lives of my students personally. So I'm going to be adding something to this content, or by supplementing and changing some few things to the content. So that takes us to the shortcomings of this existing material, which is that it is relevant, but does not actually reflect the everyday experiences of my learners. It is far-fetched. My learners cannot easily connect with the content. They can connect with the content, but it is far-fetched. They can't really see it in their everyday life. So how do I bring it into their everyday life? I'm going to be substituting it with something. So I'll come up with a warm-up. And if I were to ask, so if you were to use an image to talk about a teacher, which one would you choose? So I don't know if I should put this up to someone in the chat box. If you were to use any of this image to talk about a teacher, which one would you choose? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes.
So I was asking if you were to use,
So
sorry,
most people seem to be writing a watering can in the chat box.
okay, all right, watering can, great, wonderful responses, all right, a ladder, thank you, Taba, a tree, thank you, Susan, a tree, thank you, Erzi, a tree, thank you very much. I love the responses. So this activity right here is to instill in students, is to prepare students for material that is actually going to raise an awareness on how they can use their humanist values in real life situations. So I'm going to bring in a lesson, which is this is something I got from a blog, which is something that actually happened in 2020, where a student stabbed a teacher in the class. So we are talking about resolving conflicts. So, like I said, the previous passage did not really connect with my students in their everyday experiences. So I had to bring in something that the students can identify themselves in it. So I took this from the Cameroon Radio Television blog, which is recounting how a student actually took the life of a teacher while in class. So I'm going to make my students read this after making them to come up with the different ways they can relate to a teacher being a watering can, a teacher being a tree, alluding these humanist values and positive values to a teacher. We read this, and then I would ask the students questions that will raise them, that will enhance critical thinking. For example, I'm sorry. This passage, if I should say it again, is actually about a student who murdered a teacher who was disrespectful. The student was disrespectful, and the teacher, in the course of trying to, put the student out, the student took an object from his bag and wounded the teacher, and the teacher ended up dying. So I'm using this passage not only to teach a language point, for example, teach the conditional, or what will you have done if you find yourself in this situation, or what should you do if you find yourself in such a situation. I'm not only teaching language point, I am also trying to use this to instill in the students some humanist values. So I'm going to be, after reading the passage, I would ask them questions that would enhance critical thinking, like, what could the teacher have done to make a difference? Or what could the student have done to make a difference? What would you do if you find yourself in such a situation? What measures would you take to avoid a similar situation from happening? When students give responses to these questions, it will enable them to evaluate what they should do and what they should not do. It will encourage them in and keeping them away to think about certain things they should do in the school milieu and what they shouldn't do. Because I chose this text because there was a period in my country, there was a lot of violence in school milieu, and I thought we could bring that into our lessons in the classroom to sensitize our students, to educate them about these values that we need to encourage in our society. So I think bringing in these questions will make the students assess their ways, and will also make them to understand the way they should react when they come in contact with certain situations in real life. So after this, I'll give the students the opportunity to evaluate themselves, which I think the Coursebook doesn't have. I think the Coursebook should have a part at the end where students can evaluate themselves if they have acquired certain competencies. For example, self-evaluation or self-assessment questions. For instance, I can use models to talk about peaceful resolution of conflict. I can use the conditional to talk about resolving conflicts. I can use emotional intelligence to resolving conflicts, and I can apply empathy in resolving conflicts. This, at the end of the day, would permit the student to understand if he actually was implicated in the learning process, or if he or she realizes that there's something I didn't get straight. The student might ask questions, the student might go back to see where there are loopholes in the course of the lesson. So I think this is what I actually prepared for adapting when it comes to resolving conflicts. So I have another picture here, which is about cultural diversity. This is a speaking lesson where, and the textbook says, working groups look at these photographs and discuss the questions. What do you think the events are? In which countries or cultures do you think they take place? I present a picture like this to my students. I think first thing is that my class will be boring, because they would, most of them maybe, I think maybe they will know about this one right here, the Indian, because some of them watch Indian movies, but the others will be kind of, it will be strange to them. So they might not easily situate themselves in a content like this. So I need to make my class engaging. I need to make my class in such a way that students have that confidence to talk. They feel motivated to talk. So I feel in as much as the content is relevant, I need my students to understand, to have this notion of cultural diversity, to understand about other cultures. I will not take this picture away, but I will supplement this picture with something else, with something like this. Having a clear understanding of the cultural background of my students, I decided to come up with this, where my students can easily communicate, they can easily identify themselves in a picture like this. If I start my lesson with a picture like this, I believe my students will say, because they can actually identify themselves in the pictures. For example, this one here has to do with probably a festival with the Bulus in my country. This one here has to do with also a festival with the people from the western region of my country. And here also a festival from the people of the north region of my country. And here it is a wedding. So if I start with a picture like this, students will be motivated to talk. Some will even come in front of the class and decide to tell how it actually happens in their different cultural backgrounds. After introducing this, then I can come back to this original picture and ask them to do some comparing and contrasting. What do you see that is actually the same, maybe just from the way of dressing? Do you think there's some similarities and differences? I think some would come right up here to the Zulus and say, oh, the Zulus, they have the same outfit like the Bulus. The Bulu down here, they dress almost the same. And a lesson like this will be very engaging. Students will be coming with ideas left and right, comparing and contrasting, and this gives opportunity for students to build that awareness, cultural awareness, talk about cultural diversity. So in a lesson like this, students will be able to interact, feel motivated to communicate freely as they can relate to the content. And this goes a long way to boost your confidence. Learners will be able to use vocabulary related to cultural diversity, tradition, cultures, multiculturalism, and tolerance. They will be able to compare and contrast, which will enhance critical thinking and research skills. For example, they can talk about, do the Zulus of South Africa and the Bulus of Cameroon share the same ancestral background? considering the fact that maybe they have the same name, or almost the same name, Zulu, Bulu, and they dress the same way. Students can also be able to use grammar points like linking verbs, for example, to express tolerance towards other cultures. The Bulu traditional outfit looks similar to that of the Zulus. It feels good to learn about other cultures or the culture of others. Learners will also be able to use question forms like what, who, why, and how to make inquiries about other cultures, thereby promoting the sense of community, positive interaction, and empathy. Learners at the end will be able to assess themselves on both language and humanist values like empathy, cultural tolerance, and sociability. I think this particular point is very important, especially when you want to integrate humanist values in your lesson. Learners should be able to say that they have acquired this and how can they use it in real life situations. You can ask learners to do presentations, you can ask them to carry out some field research and present them in class and say what they feel about using these values in their real life situation. So that said, I hope I have not gone beyond time. Thank you very much. HLT.Digital, thank you for giving me this opportunity to present the little I know about humanist language, humanizing the Coursebook. Thank you.
Thank you, Ina. It was great that you were finally able to share your presentation with us. And there's certainly a lot of crossover there with some of the things that Kath was saying about the aims and objectives of working with students in the lessons and humanizing the material you're working with. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
So we have ended a little earlier than planned for this section. So there is a short break now, so everybody can go and make a cup of tea, have a sandwich, have some cake, whatever you normally do at this time in the afternoon. And then we will come back at 2 to 3 to hear from Alan Pulvernes and then Torsten Merce before ending with the closing panel. So I hope to see you all back here shortly. Thank you. I'll make a start. Once again, I'll remind you that we are recording. So if you don't want to appear on screen, turn your camera off. So I would like to welcome our next speaker today, who is Alan Pulvernes. Alan is a director of Transform ELT and a senior consultant for Nile. He has worked as teacher and trainer in Algeria, Canada, Germany, Italy, Russia, and the UK, as a consultant for the British Council on curriculum renewal, syllabus design, materials development, and reader development projects in Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, and Russia. Alan is co-author of a number of course books, including the award-winning Macmillan Short Course Programme and the TKT course. He has published widely, including in ELT Journal, Modern English Teacher, and British Studies Now. In 2013, with Brian Tomlinson, a chapter in Developing Materials for Language Teaching. And in 2015, 2 chapters in Assessing Language Teachers' Professional Skills and Knowledge. His specialist interests are drama and literature in ELT and intercultural awareness. From 2000 to 2004, he edited IATEFL conference selections, and from 2002 to 2006, he co-chaired the British Council Oxford Conference on the Teaching of Literature. And clearly your bio increases as your distinguished career gets longer. The title of Alan's talk today is Humanising Your Coursebook. Most teachers would readily agree that there is no such thing as the perfect coursebook, and very often not even the right coursebook for their class. The great problem with coursebooks is that they are designed for everyone and for no one. But in fact, The great advantage of coursebooks is precisely that they are designed for everyone and for no one. This talk will explore some modes of adaptation, options open to the teacher who wants to be in control of published teaching resources rather than being controlled by them. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you, Sarah. Sorry, just trying to get rid of the gallery on the right-hand side, but it's not going away. Okay. So in this presentation, I'd like to take a step back and look at the idea of adaptation in a number of ways, but in one way in particular, which I take to be especially in the spirit of the idea of humanizing the course book. So I've actually called the talk Adapt or Die, which is commonly held to be a reference to Darwin. And if you take a cursory look online, you'll find this quote or other quotes very much like it. It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent. It's the one that's most adaptable to change. And this is often abbreviated to adapt or die. In fact, if you search a little further, you'll find out that Darwin never actually said this, but it's one of those quotations that we all think we know, and that we all think was said by Charles Darwin. Oh, not disappearing. Yeah, so I thought it was a useful title because I think that it's not necessarily the most competent teacher that survives, nor the most compliant, but the one that adapts and that is ready to adapt the course book. Here we are. Let's see what's happened. As Sarah mentioned in her introduction to the whole afternoon, one of the focal points and one of the major outputs of the Erasmus Plus project that we're contributing to is an archive of occasional writings and notes and letters written by Mario Rinvolucri over a number of years of teaching and training, a lot of it pre-digital, and the point of departure for the project, in fact, was Mario's offer to Claudia Bednarova at the Bridge School in Bratislava to take this store of personal writing and to digitize it so as to make it available, to be able to disseminate it and give it some permanence. And this is something that the digital age enables us to do. So one of the things that we've been doing is going painstakingly through this massive, fascinating material and sorting out the the things which we felt were valuable and worth preserving from things which are perhaps more occasional and incidental. So that's been an editorial task. But in the course of doing that, I was struck by a number of comments of Mario's about course books. At one point, he said, "Where do people find the time to use course books? In a way, it's almost as surreal as having a manual for a good dinner table conversation." And again, is it for authors of textbooks to manage their teachers and their students? Surely it's natural for lessons to develop from the coming together of the people in the room. Is anything more needed? Since one thing people produce with huge ease is all sorts of text. And this sounds very much like the philosophy of dogma, the idea of emergent language that was kind of codified a few years ago by Scott Thornbury and his colleagues. So an objection to course books from Mario here as something which dictates to the teacher and to the learners the content and the conduct of the lesson, and leaves little or no space for the people involved in that teaching and learning encounter to generate their own texts. And we'll come back to Mario's archive at the end of this talk. No particular reference to this book. It was it's just an image of a course book. And I'd like you to think about what a course book is for you. And in order to do that, to think in terms of metaphors. I think metaphors are often a very useful way, rather like Eno's tree and ladder and watering can, a useful way to unlock and uncover our thinking. So what is the course book for you? And I'll make a few suggestions and we'll see what comes up in the chat box. Does the course book have the status of Holy Writ? Is it a book that has to be obeyed, that has to be followed, and that has to be believed in? Is it something that fixes the content and the process of what goes on in the classroom? As a teacher, do you feel, if you're using a course book, that it confines you like a straitjacket, denies you the kind of freedom and the kind of liberty that you would like to have, but the course book prevents you from exercising? Do you regard it as a survival kit, as something to fall back on, a security blanket, something which rescues you when things threaten to fall apart? Does it feel like a crutch, something that supports you when you're having difficulties? Or do you see it perhaps as a supermarket where you can wander around and select the items that appeal to you? And perhaps when you get your shopping home, the course book then functions as a recipe or a recipe book, which enables you to mix and match different ingredients to produce the right kind of lesson? Or is it just a compass which gives you direction, but leaves you the freedom to follow your own path? Or is it simply a springboard, something that gives you a point of departure where you can jump off, but follow what happens in the classroom, follow the text that's produced by the encounter between you and the learners. A life buoy and shackles. A lot of the above: a survival kit, a crutch, a supermarket, and a compass. A starting point, an instrument. So a number of different perspectives on this. And I would like to think that it's more in the area of the bottom row, the resources that enable you, that give you a foundation, that give you a platform, but that leave you enough freedom to develop more personalized lessons. Malgosha saying, I suppose it can be any of these, depending on the teacher's confidence and circumstances and the stage of their career. Certainly to begin with, it's much more like a survival kit and a compass. And the more confident you become and the more experienced you become, then the more you can exercise those freedoms represented in the bottom line. A resource from many to be curated and adapted. That's a nice definition. At first, it was a manual about how to teach, later a way to find out about new ideas, occasionally a huge burden, as adapting and supplementing became a lot of work. Finally, it became like a library full of more good material than I have time to use. It's a really thorough and very thoughtful response. Okay. What are the problems with course books? They may not be a perfect match with curriculum goals. Alternatively, they may take over and become a de facto syllabus. More material than time available. Perhaps dependence on technology and supplementary components, which these days are richer and more varied than ever. Looking at some current course books online on publishers' websites just earlier today, I was struck by how much additional material there is now online. The book itself as a physical object is just the tip of the iceberg. And as we've said, they're written for the widest possible market, the widest possible audience, and therefore are almost inevitably, to a greater or lesser extent, culturally inappropriate. And it's those two final points that I'd like to focus on particularly, and think about ways in which we can counter that homogeneity, that assumption that the material is going somehow to work anywhere and everywhere. The limitations of the course book. I've asked teachers these questions. What are the typical lacks? What do course books fail to provide? What do they not provide enough of? What can they be reasonably expected to provide? And what should the teacher assume that it's their responsibility to provide. And the kind of answers that I've got are, for what's lacking, choice, variety, topicality. Coursebooks become dated very, very quickly, and phonology, often lacking or treated minimally. What they don't provide enough of: practice, assessment, and productive skills work. Speaking and writing often relegated to the bottom right-hand corner of a double-page spread. What the coursebook can be expected to provide: text, certainly, information about the language, visuals, and structure. Perhaps one of the most valuable aspects of the coursebook is its organizational function, the way in which it provides a framework so that learners can see where they're going, look back and see what they've done, and build their learning in a progressive way. By contrast, what the teacher should be expected to provide: warm-up activities, ideas for presentation, ideas for further practice and consolidation. But we've left out one very significant partner in this situation: what could be provided by the learners. And that's what I'd like to focus on. We can see the lesson as a partnership, as a three-sided partnership between teacher, learner, and book. Clearly, there's an obvious exchange between teacher and learner. The book provides guidance, information, stimulus, input for both teacher and learners. The teacher may have or may assume a degree of agency to influence, to play with, to modify, or in various ways change what's provided in this static object, the course book. But what we don't often think of is the possibility of the student, the learner, doing the same. So what could be provided by the learners? In an article in HLT.Digital by David Clark, he suggested 5 basic principles: learner commitment, the feeling of being engaged as the learner being engaged as a partner, rather than simply being on the receiving end of decisions made by a partnership of book and teacher. The learner functioning as a materials writer and collaborator, as a problem solver, and as a knower, someone who brings knowledge and experience to the class. I think Hugh's examples in the first talk today about the anecdotes and experiences and language that learners could bring to the class when he asked the right kind of genuine, open questions were a great example of how what the learner brings can contribute quite substantially to the lesson. And finally, as an evaluator and assessor. And as Clark says, why leave it all to the teacher? So learners can be tasked with selection of texts, with taking the tasks that are found in the course book, which are often, for reasons of space, relatively short, but can be extended, creating new tasks, constructing activities, and constructing tests, questioning and quizzing each other. There are a number of ways in which adaptation happens. The teacher and or the learners asking, how can I add to it? How can I augment it? Extension strategies, modification strategies. How can I change it? How can I make it more appropriate to my experience, to my context? The kind of adaptation that Enno was suggesting with visuals, with photographs that her learners could relate to more immediately than they could necessarily to the ones provided in the textbook. Supplementation strategies. What can I add to it? How can I enrich it? What extra visual material, textual material, outside resources, online resources can I add to enrich the course book? And failing all else, substitution. What can I replace it with? It seems to me that these are the options available, and in every case, the learners are as valid and important sources of applying these strategies, of bringing extra relevant resources to bear, and even of suggesting alternatives. Adaptation happens because there are syllabus constraints and the material needs to be tailored and modified in order to meet those demands of the syllabus. Because of availability or lack of availability of resources, because of classroom dynamics, there may be ways in which the material needs to change to enable it to work with a particular group and particular relationships within that group in a given class. Because of learner personalities, learning preferences, personal relationships, personal histories, all the personal and social baggage that learners bring with them. Course books tend to perceive learners or construct learners as recipients of methodology rather than as people, and that's not surprising. Course books are written by people like us sitting in studies with laptops, and perhaps we've visited some classrooms, perhaps we've tried out some material, but we're writing with the best guess as to what will work at a particular level, if we're lucky, in a particular market, though very often we're writing for a global market, which is, as said before, everywhere and nowhere, everyone and no one. And so the task, it seems to me, for teacher and learners is to take that rather neutral material and personalize it, localize it and personalize it, make it work in their particular context. So learners' motivations and expectations will also play a part. And it's those last three, again, that are most relevant in terms of what learners can bring to the table, and how the generalized tendencies of the course book can be brought into a particular place at a particular time for a particular group of people. So what can be adapted? The language throughout the book, the process, the procedures, the ways in which the course book dictates or recommends or suggests that the learning takes place. That can all be modified and adapted. Content certainly can be adapted, and level can be adapted. So in short, everything that the course book does is up for grabs. Everything is open to variation, modification, expansion, reduction, reordering, and as we've said, as a last resort, substitution. So this is a set of strategies for adaptation from Alan Maley in an article written with, or as a chapter in one of Brian Tomlinson's books about materials development. Leaving things out, adding things, reducing text, exercises, tasks, cutting them down to size, extending them, enlarging them, rewriting, modifying, replacing, reordering, and what Maley calls branching, which is a kind of modification. It's offering alternatives, offering alternative pathways, giving learners more choice, not only about what they do, but about how they might do it. Yeah, it was a chapter in Brian's first book on materials development. And just to close, going back to Mario's archive, however good a course book is, it's always in the third person. It always talks about them, what they're doing, what they're going to do. And the humanistic approach that I'd like to emphasize is changing that third person orientation of the language and the process of the book to a second person one, talking about what you, the learner, or the learner talking about what I, the learner, do and are doing and is going to do. And finally, Mario says at another point, a course book text is outside any relationship. It's cold. And I hope that the presentations that we've heard today suggest a range of ways of warming up the course book and making it something warm and appealing and establishing relationships between teacher and learners and amongst learners, rather than remaining external and cold. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. That was great. And I really like that ending, thinking about warming up the course book rather than adapting or changing. So there's lots of ideas for us to do some warming there. Thank you. Okay. For our final presentation today, I would like to introduce you to, there he is, to Torsten Moers. So Torsten is Professor of English as a Foreign Language Education with a special focus on Anglophone literatures and cultures. In his research, he explores inter- and transcultural learning and cultural diversity, pedagogies of teaching literature, and digital education in EFL. He places particular emphasis on engaging with LGBTQI+ diversity and queer theory in English language teaching and learning, and on researching teachers developing digital competencies. In the main, he investigates EFL education with theoretical and conceptual research designs, including meta views on how such research can be conducted. Torsten's talk today is called A Queer Critique of Coursebooks, Humanising Representation Practices Towards LGBTQI+ Inclusion. Time and again, coursebooks have been critiqued for their normative representation practices of cultural diversity and diverse identities. Is this fair? In this talk, Torsten will take stock of the queer-informed critique that has so far been directed against the ELT publishing industry and provide examples of how new or changing representation practices could make coursebooks more inclusive and human. Over to you, Torsten.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, for your kind introduction. I'm sorry I missed the previous presentations because I had a full day of teaching and I just left my course room 15 minutes ago. So I hope I can connect to the other talks nonetheless. And welcome to everyone who is here today. So let me share my slides first. Okay, so Sarah already said what I will be talking about, so thanks for that introduction. I will provide a glimpse into the research I'm doing. Next to the research areas that Sarah pointed out, I also carry out coursebook analyses, critical coursebook analyses, and that is from a critical and queer lens. So I'm interested in how coursebooks represent people, identities, or issues that can be summarized as LGBTIQ+, to use this broad umbrella term for all non-normative sexualities, identities, and bodies. But this also includes the question of how heterosexuality and normative genders are represented in coursebooks. That's also part of the game. I have 2 points of entry. This is the first point of entry, and maybe this question has already been discussed sufficiently throughout the previous presentation. So my concern is, or the question could be, can coursebooks actually cause transformation? Maybe that's a very difficult claim coursebooks have to live up to. Certainly, that's my conviction. They should mirror transformation. They should mirror social changes. And if it's not the coursebook itself that can bring about transformation, it's certainly the teachers using the coursebook that could bring about transformation. And here with transformation, I mean, in particular, bringing in queer diversity into coursebooks. A second point of entry, this is a bit like a privileged disclaimer. I work in the German context, and it needs to be known and noted that this is a very privileged context for queer diversity, in particular. So next to being like a more open and liberal society, we have many EFL curricula in Germany at the moment that have begun to include the need to address the diversity of sexual and gender identities in the EFL classroom. So it's a bit like almost ironic that in Germany, it's a need to embrace queer diversity in EFL classrooms and lessons. And it's not a question of whether it should be done or not, it has to be done. And the consequence is, of course, that teachers, course books, and everything else that makes up the classroom needs to mirror this curricular development. And I'm aware that this is a very privileged context. Around the world, globally, there are contexts where bringing in queer diversity is more problematic or challenging, of course. And a bit of background, the question of embracing queer perspectives in EFL education, it's not necessarily a very novel or necessarily innovative phenomenon. This has been out there since the early 1990s, that committed researchers, practitioners, or activist practitioners brought up the issue of LGBTIQ+ inclusion. And sometimes there is the claim in research that we are a monosexual or heteronormative discipline. I wouldn't necessarily say so, that we are monosexual anymore, because there is a very productive stream of discussions and publications that try to address queer issues in our discipline. This is just as a reminder that much research has been done and is available, but I won't go into the details of all of these publications that you can see on this slide, because my focus is actually coursebook research. And this is the perspective that I bring in as a researcher. There are basically, and this is following Harvard's distinction, 3 possible things to look at. You can look at the coursebook as it exists with all the content that is on the printed page. These would be content analyses. So you can look into any coursebook and count how many LGBTIQ identities or people are represented or not. And this is actually quite an easy and enjoyable thing to do, content analyses. The coursebook doesn't run away. You don't need to make appointments with the coursebook. It's simply there. You can look at it. You can draw data from the coursebook. It's more challenging to research the production side to coursebooks, because this would mean you would have to interview the people who are involved in production. This has been done, but to a lesser degree. And a larger gap exists when it comes to the actual usage of coursebooks, so which is called consumption in Harvard's distinction. So we know very little how teachers actually work with, use, adapt, change, manipulate, whatever word you would like to use, when their coursebook, for example, is unqueer, which means that it doesn't contain any LGBTIQ representation. Such studies, to my knowledge, don't exist at this point. And the research I'm going to present today is a content analysis with a few ideas for consumption that can be derived from this analysis. And by and large, research has shown that the default representation, so whenever sexuality or gender is represented in a coursebook, it has to be classified as heteronormative, so clearly heterosexual, and also clearly bigendered. So it's either male or female, and also cisgender. And to a very large extent, in some coursebooks, even exclusively, there is a documented absence of LGBTIQ identities and themes. And this is a research finding that has been reproduced like forever and for ages, which indicates that the situation is not necessarily changing too much. And the study I'm going to present today, that I have carried out with 2 colleagues, Lotta König and Grit Alter, with this study, with this research, we try to broaden this rather simplistic view on coursebooks representation practices, because there is a bit more differentiated diversity when it comes to practices that we found in our coursebooks. It is challenging to research sexual and gender diversity in coursebooks, at least for 3 reasons. In order to count someone or an issue, something as LGBTIQ or LGBTIQ related, it needs to be explicitly marked. in the course book, or then there needs to be a thematic context that allows us as researchers to say, yes, this is an LGBTIQ plus focused topic. So things can only be counted, or people can only be counted if they are marked, for example, through the text that accompanies an image. And researchers have to be rather careful to make LGBTIQ related classifications just because they think a coursebook character might be LGBTIQ, which would be highly subjective. So many instances that you find in a coursebook might not have anything to do with LGBTIQ because there's no explicit mentioning. And another challenge is it's not just about counting and evaluating the quality of LGBTIQ inclusion. When it comes to sexual and gender diversity at large, it also needs to be researched how heteronormativity or normative genders are represented in a coursebook. And this is also a challenge because heterosexuality and bi-gendered systems are so normal that it's sometimes difficult to detect this normality in the coursebook. So for example, if there is like a heterosexual coursebook family, which is a standard in German EFL coursebooks, this is so normal that it's quite a challenge to really mark it as a research finding from a queer perspective. And the study we have conducted is based on 3 EFL coursebooks that are currently in use in the German school system for learners of year 9. So it's a teenage audience, if you wish, published for comprehensive schools. And the research interest at large that we followed was representation of many diversity facets, such as socioeconomic backgrounds, gender, ethnic diversity, but also LGBTIQ diversity. So I'm drawing on this particular focus as part of the larger study. But the findings for other facets of diversity are also quite interesting. For example, that many coursebooks are situated in a middle upper class socioeconomic context or background where people have enough money or pocket money to buy things, to have swimming pools, to have kitchen islands at home. This could also be a facet of critique, but today it will be about LGBTIQ plus representation. And we embraced a quantitative and a qualitative approach. So we basically counted the visibility. Is a character visible or not? Plus the voice and agency. So the discussion, the text that surround these identities was also taken into account. And our corpus contained 736 images. So we started counting and extracting the images. 458 images show human beings. And this is where it gets interesting, because then you have to make a classification. Is someone LGBTIQ or heterosexual or bigendered or transgender? And we also documented the text that surrounded these images, because very often the text makes the image more understandable or approachable, has additional information that is needed to understand the image. And sometimes this is a complicated relationship between the image and the text, as will become clear in one of the future slides. And what I will introduce now is a set of representational practices that coursebooks seem to be using at the moment to bring in sexual and gender identities. And the main representational practice, and this is a very consistent finding throughout all coursebook studies, is that there is a clear preference of heterosexuality as the norm. This simply continues to prevail. We call it the taken for granted sexuality. No explanation whatsoever is necessary. People simply are heterosexual in the coursebook or live in heterosexual family constellations. And this is the default presentation. And I used the almost cliche example of the family tree, which is often used to talk about families and family structures. And such family trees tend to be heterosexual or organized in a heteronormative way. And one challenge for researching this is, for example, when you look at the family tree, there is Jim, who seems to be a single parent dad with Melissa as his daughter. And this could lead to all sorts of speculation, of course. Jim might be a gay dad, could be. But here we don't find any additional explanation in the text that surrounds the family tree. So we simply don't know. So a researcher cannot classify Jim as LGBTIQ+ because there is no explicit text that would prove this or support this. You could argue that this family tree is quite progressive because there is ethnic diversity, and having divorce or single parent family constellations is quite progressive in itself, but it's still heteronormative. And closely linked to this normativity is that whenever a person's gender can be recognizable or is recognizable, it's 100% clear. It's male or female, and it's cisgender. There's no doubt about it. There's no trans or inter, at least no trans or inter people that are explicitly highlighted as such. I mean, you could argue that someone who passes as male in a course book could be trans, but we didn't calculate that in because the text would have to clarify that in detail. And what is interesting in cases of ambiguity, so where you might not be able to tell exactly if someone is clearly male or clearly female, the surrounding text is doing the job. So we had one example where there was like a costume party with a bit of drag and cross-dressing going on. So there is ambiguity in the images, but the surrounding text made it clear that the boys are boys and the girls are girls, of course. And this is maybe an opportunity that some course books waste. So they could operate with more ambiguity and leave it to the learners to decide how they would like to read and understand these images. Could be one change in representational practices, simply include more ambiguity. The second representational practice is, and this is probably the logical consequence of the first practice, is that some course books have no representation of any facet of LGBTIQ diversity at all. So there's complete silence and invisibility. And one of these three course books that we looked at follows this representational practice. So they are completely written out of existence. And this is quite a powerful and telling result, because we know from production-oriented coursebook research that coursebook publishers are well aware of this representational practices. So it just doesn't happen by accident and they are not aware of it. It's a deliberate choice very often. And this is why I wrote down it's written out of existence, because it's a deliberate choice very often by publishing houses not to include any facet of LGBTIQ whatsoever in whatever representation, shape, or size. But it's not necessarily as gloomy as this, because there are some more positive representations, as we will see in a few slides on. Another finding, and this is still an issue, if there are representations of LGBTIQ, they might sometimes be constructed as a problematic identity, so that the message that the coursebook sells is, yes, LGBTIQ people do exist, but it's a problem when someone is LGBTIQ. And this is a representational practice that becomes clear in this example. This is something like a blog where teenagers receive recommendations for how to organize and sort out their life. It's located in Jamaica. So coursebooks in year 9 in Germany tend to embrace the Anglophone, the English-speaking world from a wider perspective other than the UK or the US. So the Caribbean is a topic in these coursebooks, the English-speaking Caribbeans. And there's one quote by Danielle. It's in the middle of this snippet. I know what you're talking about. Life in a family can be difficult. My brother came out as gay. So from the counting perspective, this would be a visible LGBTIQ representation, because it's as my brother came out as gay. But then it goes on, what a shock to our family. And this is the problem identity. This is where being gay is related to a shock for the family. And another problem we saw in this representation is that the problem identity is only possible because it is located in Jamaica. which might reproduce other stereotypes or additional stereotypes that Jamaica is per se homophobic. So the intersectional view on that can even cause more criticism or critique. And this is the problem identity, or an example of visible, yes, but problematic still. Another approach, and this seems to become more prominent and visible in course books, is that there are positive representations in a course book, but they are rare. So like 1 or 2 representations on 150 pages. And we call that the stand-alone and stick-out representation, because it's kind of so unusual that it's there, that it's instantly recognizable as such. Very often like with rainbow flags and very visible stories. And this is, of course, something that could be welcomed because it's a step forward towards inclusion. But the problem remains that it's not normalized or usualized in any way. If you compare that to the usualization of heteronormativity, it simply is on almost all coursebook pages. But this is certainly not the case for LGBTIQ. So they need the extra page or the exotic add-on section in a unit. It is well meant, but still comes across as compartmentalized or exotic, even though it's a positive representation as such. And this is an example of how appealing it might look like at first sight. But if you look at the course book, if this is the only representation, it's sticking out. And this is an example of how teenagers might be committed to human rights or social activism. So it's a collage page. And next to protecting animal rights or taking care of elderly people, one aspect of social activism could be supporting LGBTIQ rights. And there's nothing problematic about this representation as such. It's actually really positive with this image of the gay pride parade. There's even a person who's like half naked, which could cause some controversy in some contexts if you look at the image more closely. But it's visible and out there with an accompanying text that clearly says LGBTIQ community work. And the last representational practice, and I only found one example to this date, this is where a coursebook really tries to make an effort to achieve a more complex, balanced representation with a lot of space in the coursebook offered to exploring LGBTIQ lives and issues. And this is an example from a coursebook that is called Camden Town Advanced, where there is a whole unit on questions of gender, identity, and sexual identity. And this is one example snapshot from this larger unit. And the interesting thing here is that this coursebook was published a year or 2 after the curricula have changed. And this means that when the curricula do change and coursebook publishers need to take up this curricula change, otherwise their coursebooks wouldn't be used. This is an example of how curricular change can lead to more LGBTIQ inclusion because it simply needs to be there. And so instead of simply saying there is no LGBT in any coursebook, these 5 representational practices could shed a more differentiated light on how complex and difficult it can be to bring in LGBTIQ into coursebooks. And one question now could be, what could be new strategies to queer coursebooks? And I understand queering coursebooks also as humanizing coursebooks, because it can serve the purpose to bring in LGBTIQ inclusion in a more dedicated way. One strategy, I would even say, has to be that we need more background diversity of LGBTIQ, that coursebook characters just happen to be LGBTIQ without requiring much explanation. For example, a lesbian couple as parents as part of the larger repertoire of coursebook families and people. Something that I find quite interesting is to embrace more ambiguity and openness and leave it to the task and activities that learners and teachers agree on to bring the ambiguity to life, to have like open readings of a text or image that is ambiguous. And this could be interesting for contexts that are more hostile towards LGBTIQ, because when it's ambiguous, it can be read in many different ways and could escape censorship more easily. And next to the background representation that we need, I think we also still need this explicit focalization of LGBTIQ embedded in a more normalized representational strategy with the background diversity, so that there are explicit learning opportunities for learners to engage in LGBTIQ lives, issues, themes. For example, when the topic is sports, you could, as a facet of sports, talk about the coming out of a professional sports person, just as an example. So we need like a mix of strategies, I would argue, to challenge the heteronormative status of coursebooks on the one hand, but also to bring in LGBTIQ in a more balanced fashion. And here are two examples of a publication or materials project that I was involved in together with my colleague Grit Alter. We were asked by a German publishing house to produce a set of photocopiable worksheets that had to be for the content of family and home for learners in year 5 and year 7. And we were like, okay, dear publisher, do we have a lot of freedom to bring in whatever we want? Can we think outside the box? And they were like, yeah, go ahead, do as you wish. So we didn't even have to like secretly smuggle in LGBTIQ content and then see what's happening. And here we decided for what we call a collage approach. And this could be one way of bringing in LGBTIQ content in a less explicit way, but it's still there. And here we have examples of different families with images and text that would explain these families. And 1 out of 3 texts goes like this. My name is Roberta, I'm 14 years old. I live together with my aunt Josie and her wife Jackie. They are my foster parents because my real parents couldn't take care of me anymore. So the teenager tells the story about her family next to other stories that we learn about. And in the end, it becomes like a bit political because she says, some people call us a rainbow family because my parents are lesbian, but I don't like this special word. I simply have 2 moms and could not be happier. And our experience was that the publisher, Cornesen, was quite enthusiastic about this add-on because they felt the need to be more inclusive. And this was maybe a slightly less dramatic way of bringing in this inclusion. And another example in the sense of ambiguity and openness, instead of providing a fixed family tree with ready-made family constellation, just give learners an open family tree and they can write down whatever they want into the family tree. And this is anecdotal evidence from the students I'm educating here when they are at school and they work with these fixed family trees. The learners challenge these family trees anyway. Like, oh, my grandparents are lesbian, they are not in this family tree. I have a gay uncle who is not represented in the family tree. So they would have to draw their own family trees anyway. And this could bring in, or this simple visual illustration could target this openness. But it's a side project because the main course book would still be a different course book. This is just a material bank the knowledgeable teacher could work with and choose from, but it's not the mainstream publication learners would be using. I also see a few challenges, and this could be seen as a collection of conversations I had with publishers and my own students. One question could be, is there any realistic chance to win publishing houses for this particular course? I've been talking about this topic for 10 years, and I'm pretty sure that I could have used the slides from 10 years ago with the outlook and conclusions. And if there is no realistic chance for especially the global publishing industry, what could be the consequence? For the German context, it's slightly more privileged and different because now our course books need to represent LGBTIQ more broadly, but globally, this could be a different thing. My students always ask how much LGBTIQ is enough. I don't have a definite answer to that, other than at the moment, it's certainly not enough. Another danger could be the danger of the single story. If there's just one representation throughout the whole course book, this is not balanced. this is not nuanced or differentiated, and students could come to the conclusion that one story represents all LGBTIQ people. So there needs to be more than one story. What also needs to be made sure is that LGBTIQ representation doesn't come across as odd or like very deliberate or almost forced. So you would have to make like matches with topics that the course book covers anyway. And here the collage approach could be quite useful, because in almost any course book in the German market, there is a spreadsheet page with people that changed the planet or people who made a difference, like Greta Thunberg would be there or Mahatma Gandhi would be there. And why don't you include someone who advocated for LGBTIQ rights, such as Harvey Milk, the first openly gay politician in the US? Why isn't he on the spreadsheet page? That could be a solution. And something that is also challenging for publishing houses, and this is the concern they have addressed with me, we are aware of this problem, and we are willing to include LGBTIQ issues and identities to a greater extent, but they might need help selecting or curating authentic sources or creating pedagogic texts for their materials production. So they simply don't know how to do it, even though they might want to do it. So this is where there could be more conversation between researchers and practitioners. And the last call could really be to think about training teachers to stop relying on course books too much. I see a lot of value in course books, and I wouldn't discharge them wholeheartedly. Maybe it's a balance. Use the course book if it's good, change the course book, adapt the course book if it doesn't meet the purposes and objectives you have in mind. But teacher training is probably a very important issue if course books continue to remain unqueer and publishing houses cannot be one for this particular course. And maybe with these provocative challenges or strategies, I would like to close my talk and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Torsten. Very thought-provoking, as the comment say. And I think, yeah, I mean, while it is disappointing to hear you say that you could have used the same things 10 years ago, you know, I guess meaningful change is slow.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as we are continuing to move in the right direction, then that can only be a good thing.
Yeah. Thank you. At the moment, I'm seeing something like a tilting point. So there might be very gradual awareness raising with change for the better. But this needs to be shown in more studies.
Yeah, I mean, at Transform ELT, we've just been asked to do a curriculum, a new curriculum framework. I won't give any more detail than that, but there's only one topic that can't be addressed. And I guess you can guess what that is.
Yeah,
so,
okay.
So yeah, context is obviously a really important thing. And as you said, working in your particular context in Germany is a privileged position.
Yeah, it is. And I'm fully aware of that, yeah.
Sure. Right. So I'm going to give you all a chance to stretch your legs, make a cup of tea, have another cake, feed the cat, whatever you want to do. And we will start again in 10 minutes for the closing panel discussion. Thank you. I think Isora sums up the day so far very well when she says, as we have seen today, course books are not perfect. And on that note, I will hand you over to Alan Pulviness, who will facilitate the final panel discussion. Alan.
Thanks, Sarah. It struck me that looking at all the presentations, that I guess a couple of them, mine and Hugh's, were about process and the ways in which course books can be handled, whereas Enno's and Kath's and Torsten's were more concerned with humanistic values, humanism with a capital H, if you like. And yeah, I wondered what you might like to say about that. How you see those two things as being related, the ways in which coursebook content can be humanized, radicalized, changed at the point of production, and what kind of influence you see that as having on the processes in the classroom coming out of that. Kath, would you like to say something? Perhaps I could also ask at the same time, if you had the opportunity as a writer, and this would be for Enno as well, to trial the materials, or to get them trialed, to find out something about how that content actually worked at the point of delivery.
Yeah, I mean, you do often get the chance of getting stuff trialed. You do quite often, you manage to get teachers, depending on which publisher you're working for, and obviously the bigger publishers have more contacts, and you can send material out and get feedback on it, and that's often very helpful. But there's always the problem that there are so many different people pulling at what the coursebook wants to be. So you have the sales reps who want to be able to go and sell it to their particular market, and they will have different things that they want depending on which country they're coming from. And then you will have the actual teachers who want something quite different because they're thinking about their specific students. And you have the publishers who've always got their eye on the budget. And, one of the deep frustrations, listening to Thorsten is, as a writer, is this insistence that books have to be global, which means that they get bland. They get super bland, and you can't put anything controversial in case it offends someone in one country. And really, if we could produce books that were tailored for different countries, you would have so much. There was so much more that you could include.
Yeah, Enno, how about you? Have you had the opportunity to try out your adapted materials to see what difference the adaptation would make?
Oh yes, I always do adapt my lessons because I teach students of I teach students who study English for specific needs. So I am always in the process of adapting my lessons because, like we said, course books are for everybody, but the students I have in front of me, to make my lessons really engaging, to make the exchange meaningful, I have to actually adapt my lessons. So I'm always in the process of adapting my lessons all the time. I teach students from technical education, students who study English for a specific purpose. So you need to get to class actually prepared. You understand what they actually need, what they will use the language for. So I always adapt my lessons. The only problem I have with adaptation is that if you want to take into consideration everyone's needs, like teaching from the context, my context, I think the book will be really voluminous, it will be very big. And when it is big, it's quite expensive and people will not be able to buy. So I think making the textbook for everybody gives the opportunity for a teacher to think outside the box, to be creative, to be innovative with material. So I'm okay with the textbook actually being open for everybody to adapt.
Thank you.
Could you repeat the question for Hugh, please, Alan?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I was asking Hugh about the difference between adaptation of content So to make the actual material more open, more accessible, more appropriate, and the interventions that the teacher can make in the way that they use the material, and yeah. You're mute, Hugh.
Yeah, sorry. I think the latter is much more important than the former, because I think it's sort of delusional to imagine that you can have content which is going to tick the boxes for every student everywhere in every context. Even if you've got students the same age, from the same city in the same country, they're not all interested in the same things. They don't always relate to the same things. Even if they're doing like an ESP course, they don't always work like that. What a good teacher can do is to work out how to connect what is there to the students. And just a very quick story, Dorothy Zemak told this once. She said once she was teaching this group from Yemen, okay, and there was a text in the course book about museums. And one of the students said, why are we even doing this? We don't really have museums in Sana'a. This is a kind of crazy thing to talk about. And she said, yes, but you do have collections of things, and you do have, what other vocabulary do we have here? Oh, you have buildings which house particular kinds of things. And she basically just pulled out 3 or 4 bits of vocabulary and said, okay, we won't talk about museums. We'll talk about any collections of things you've got, any buildings in Sana'a that house particular things. And from this, the students sort of went, oh, yeah, okay. So I have a collection of ceremonial daggers. And they end up having a discussion about Yemeni ceremonial daggers. And I think what good teachers do is they're able to take elements of the text, often language elements of the text, and say, okay, you might not find the topic massively engaging, but there's some language here that we can work with and connect to our own reality. So I think the teacher interventions are much more important and much more possible than imagining there's content which fits everybody's everywhere, you know, or that can be adapted for particular groups. I think the way you adapt it is like that. You take things from it and you give the students what you think they need from it in a way that relates to them.
How would you react to that, Torsten? Because your mission seems to be very much to influence the content of the course books at the point of production.
Yeah, good question. I think that it's kind of unrealistic to assume that course books are like complete people pleasers, because they need to please the researcher who's group critical, they need to please the teacher who has to use the course book, they need to please the publishers who need to be fine with the sales and numbers that the course books are generating, to parents, to conservative or liberal communities. So they need to please many people, and this is simply unrealistic. I think we need to be realistic about it, that it's unrealistic to have this like perfect inclusive course book. It probably doesn't exist and will never exist, as you said earlier. Still, I think it's important to keep up the conversation with publishers, because there is growing awareness that publishers at least see the need to be more inclusive. Very often they don't make the jump, because then the course book might not sell, and that's very often the only reason why they are not doing it. But compartmentalizing the market could work instead of having the global course book. I mean, I work in a publishing market in Germany where no global publisher is dominant in the coursebook industry for coursebooks that are used in the school system, and that's a massive market. So it's 3 German publishing houses producing something for the German market, and it's working. There are coursebooks that are inclusive towards diversity to an extent that might be unimaginable in global coursebooks. So this is a case in point where splitting up markets could do a job. And another idea I've recently started to think about is maybe to embrace digital or ebook opportunities more. You could have like a unit with an idea behind it, with a major theme behind it, with a set of linguistic structures behind it. But then with like digital opportunities, you could say, this could be one option, this could be one option, this could be one option, and teachers could choose with the digital buffet, which version of a unit they might put into practice. And then it could be less dramatic in one context and more dramatic in another context. So Coursebook publishers would still need to adapt and be more flexible and offer even more than they are already offering anyway. But sadly, I've come to some conclusion that it's unrealistic to make such demands and expect wonders. And of course, as a researcher, it's always easier to criticize a coursebook than write a good coursebook myself. I know that. Yeah, but I think we need to be more realistic about it, and then empower teachers, as you also said, right? Teachers need to work with the material, and then they need to know strategies they can use to adapt such materials.
Perhaps you ought to publish a collection of your worksheets, Torsten.
Pardon?
Perhaps you should publish a collection of your worksheets.
Maybe I should do that, yeah. And make them global.
In your introduction, you mentioned that, well, certainly in Lower Saxony, and I got the impression in a number of other Länder, that the curriculum authorities, State Ministry of Education, were quite positive in terms of these representational issues. I wonder what the relationship is between those authorities, those educational authorities, and the publishers, because there seems to be a bit of a disconnect. Perhaps it's a naive question, but I wonder what sort of pressure are the publishers under, if any, to shift?
Yeah, there is a very clear relationship, a very structured relationship. Whatever is used within the state-sanctioned German school system needs to be approved. So any coursebook needs to be approved by like a commission, and they check if a coursebook that a publishing house wants to put on the market fulfills the curricular requirements. So technically speaking, if Cornesen or Klett or any other publishing house in Germany doesn't include LGBTIQ diversity, even though it's a curricular requirement, they would be criticized for it and asked to include it and improve it. So there's like a lot of quality control, if you wish. And this is maybe the power of the curriculum that could be forcing the publishers to follow suit. So if it's in the curriculum, it needs to be in the coursebook. That's the.
But it can be evaded to some extent by a kind of box ticking exercise.
Yeah, it could be. It could be. However, sometimes the curricula define gender and sexual identity to be a broader topic. For example, in the new regulations for my federal state from 2025 onwards for the upper secondary level, Shakespeare was deleted from the reading list and replaced by the new topic, a question of sexuality and gender. Which, I mean, you can combine Shakespeare and sexuality and gender anyway, so there's no need to delete him. But that's an interesting move, I think. And if it's like a semester topic or a term topic for upper secondary education, it cannot just be a box ticking exercise on page 58. So it needs to be there more broadly.
Certainly a lot of scope for cross-dressing in Shakespeare.
Of course. Speaking of ambiguity and openness.
Yeah.
Hugh, a specific question that came up in the chat. And I think you probably answered this to some extent, but it was striking that most of your examples were concerned with vocabulary items.
Yeah.
And the question was about the scope for humanizing the teaching of grammar.
I saw that question.
Yeah.
I think the exact question was, how can you use CCQs to humanize grammar? And my short answer would be, you can't. Okay, because it's not what they're designed to do. CCQs are designed to basically ensure that students have grasped the underlying conceptual meaning of the grammar structure. That's it. That's all they're designed to do. And they're designed to do that in a very quick and efficient kind of way. So I would say, if what you're looking to do is to make the teaching of grammar a bit more human and a bit more connected to your students, you shouldn't be looking for CCQs to do that. How you might go about doing that is a whole other much bigger question that I'm happy to talk about, but it's the answer would be not through CCQs. It is my immediate short answer. It's just not what they do.
Yeah, there was a question from Chris Fry. He mentioned his experience at one point of offering students kind of menu, making the coursebook units into a kind of menu and selecting the units that appealed to them, that they found interesting, which he says worked very well. But at a certain point, you know, he was under pressure to cover all the units probably in the right order. And yeah, it occurs to me also from what Torsten was saying about a buffet of digital units, that might be a way to go to break down the sort of single uniformity of the book, and to produce something that's more fluid and more flexible.
I just saw Katie's comment in the chat box there, and I think there's actually almost a kind of opposite issue. Okay, I just had a meeting last week where the new series I've done, Outcomes, they've got this huge digital platform called Spark. Okay, and like every publisher's got their own huge digital platform now with loads and loads of stuff thrown onto it. And I think actually the problem is almost, it's, you know, like when you're going to Starbucks and you want to order a cappuccino, if you're in Italy, you go and order a cappuccino and they don't ask you any questions. They just give you a cappuccino and it's great. And it probably costs you €1. You go into Starbucks and it's like, what kind of coffee do you want? What kind of milk do you want? What kind of syrup do you want? What kind of sugar do you want? So just give me a cappuccino. And I think it's a similar problem sometimes for teachers where there's so much extra. The digital buffet is so vast and expansive that in the end you just kind of go, do you know what? I'm just going to have this. Thank you. That's all I need. And I think sometimes there's a kind of overdose of stuff that you're bombarded with. In the old days, it used to be resource packs and photocopiables or whatever. And again, I think it's maybe making the mistake of thinking that it's materials that are going to transform the classroom, when actually it's not the materials. It's the relationship between the teacher, the materials, and the students, and that three-way dance that you're engaged in, with the materials as actually the least important. You know, I hate to say it as a writer, but the least important part of the triangle is the material. It's basically the teachers and the students and the dance that you perform with the material. And bringing more and more material into that doesn't alter the fundamental dynamics of that relationship. In the end, it's about the teacher and the students and finding space for the students and ways of connecting the students to the language and the language to the students. So I'm sort of slightly, I think it's a good thing to have a digital buffet, but I'm not surprised by the fact that a lot of teachers don't take advantage of most of the dishes on offer. You know, and I know they're tracking it a lot more now. So the publishers are all using, you know, they're using big data and they're tracking how much of what's on the digital buffet do people actually eat. You know, what do they eat most? What do they just leave on the side? And a lot of stuff just gets left on the side. So, you know, I don't think it's bad to provide it, but I think a lot of it's just bells and whistles and window dressing. And for teachers, the real meat is the book that they take in, and then what happens.
Well, speaking of bells and whistles and extras, there were a couple of suggestions in the chat. One about using Flipgrid for kind of video discussion, and one about using Padlet, which is mostly more text-based, but performs a similar function. And I wondered if any of you had had any experience of using that kind of supplementary resource as a way of creating more interaction, creating more dialogue around the material, unpacking the material in a way that might not be feasible in a 45-minute lesson, or if you had any views either way about the usefulness of that kind of add-on.
Yeah, I think a lot of those add-ons can be really useful. There's another one called something like Mentimeter, is it? It's one of those. Yeah, that one's a really good one. I really like using that because it allows students to give their opinions in a very sort of quick way. It allows you to gather those opinions together. There's a word cloud app that I quite often use, which is a really useful way of just seeing a pictorial representation of how popular certain ideas or certain words are. So obviously it's very dependent on the technology that's available to the teacher and to the student and to the classroom. And I think it can be easy to get sidetracked into getting so excited about that technology that you actually forget the sort of, the meat and potatoes of the teaching. But I think that a Padlet as well. I've not come across Flipgrid. I haven't ever used, so I couldn't talk about that.
I guess from my point of view, I kind of agree with what Catherine said. I think two caveats I would add is one, are you getting paid for the work you're spending, the time you're spending at home to make all the extra digital material that you're asking your students to do? Okay, because if you're not, you might want to think about doing something else with your time that I think often there's a kind of issue where you have one or two teachers who are really obsessed with technology and they spend a lot of their free time making all this extra material. And if you're teaching with those people, it makes you look shit because, excuse my French, you're making those people look bad because, it's like, well, my other teacher does Padlet and Quizlet and does all this stuff. And it's like, yeah, I have a life outside of teaching that they don't get paid for it. They're just a nerd. So I think sometimes there's a kind of, let's not overwork ourselves for no extra recompense. I think also in the end, all of that stuff is basically just homework. Okay, it's a new form of digital flipped homework, but it relies on students doing the homework a lot of the time. And you can find extra texts, you can find great videos, you can find different angles on topics that course books don't explore. If 60% of the students don't watch it or read it, your preparation for how it's going to work in the lesson falls flat. And the number of times I've done homeworks where I've said to students, I want you to watch this video in the class, we're going to talk about it. And I teach teachers a lot of the time, and they come to class and they kind of go, oh, I didn't have time. You're like, what? None of you have done the homework. No. So in the end, it does still depend on people being motivated to do all that stuff outside of class. And again, it can be really, really useful. And if you've got the right group and you find the right texts, I think it can be brilliant and it can be quite motivating and give a different angle on the material that's by definition sort of sanitized in the course book. But it really depends on the group doing the homework, as has always been the case in a sense with homework.
Yeah, I think it brings us back to that dance between teacher and learners, with the course book providing the music, but the people deciding how to move.
Yeah.
Enno, you mentioned at one point the difficulty of adaptation for inexperienced or less experienced teachers, that they don't yet have the confidence or the feeling of a capability to do some of the kinds of things that we might like to see them doing. Do you think that's an absolute constraint? Are there ways in which you think new teachers or relatively new teachers could be encouraged to take that step and to be a bit more, a little braver in making small changes that will be significant, that will engage learners more?
Yeah, I think the only way for new teachers to be motivated, you need to understand your context. You need to be able to understand what your learners actually want. You need to do what you want and love what you do. In my country, many teachers go into teaching, for the sake of teaching. But if you want to be a teacher, you should actually be a teacher. That's why I came up with those in the warm-up, I came up with those different representations of a teacher. You need to actually understand the values you put out there as a teacher. So you need to actually understand what your students want. So as a new teacher, it is true it will be quite difficult for you to indulge into adaptations of lessons and how to carry them on. Of course, you need to get involved in professional development for you to understand things like this, or you can actually visit another colleague, a colleague who is superior to you, and see how it's going on in the colleague's class to actually see how things are done. So I think it's about you, the teacher, understanding your role, the role you play for your students, and understanding what your students actually need. So
Is that something that's dealt with in by the teacher training colleges? Is there a focus in teacher training on how to get the most out of materials in that way? Or do you think
well,
that's
not really. It is true that the teacher training colleges, they try as much as possible to get the best out of the teachers, but you need to actually be a zealous teacher to go to that extreme to understand your students. It takes a teacher who is actually devoted to get your students, get what they really want. It's quite meaningful when you actually see your students getting interactive, using language the way it's supposed to be done. There are so many teachers out there who really they're out there for the pay.
But I really like your suggestion of peer observation or observing a more experienced colleague, because somehow it's much more convincing to see someone doing it than being told about it.
Than being told about it, yes. Yeah. So I think that's one of the key ways to learn.
Kath, could I ask you about or this is a question that came up in the chat, thinking of the Cassell wheel or pyramid, as you'd prefer to call it, particularly the apex of it, the responsible decision making. And the question was whether you feel that concepts like that are perhaps culturally determined and wouldn't necessarily travel everywhere. Is it something that's rather culturally restricted, or do you think it's more universal?
I think it is universal. Yeah, maybe I'm a bit too wedded to the whole idea because I've been talking about it for so long. So that's interesting, and it's not something I'd considered. So maybe I need to think about that. No, I mean, maybe your interpretation of what a responsible decision is culturally informed, but in itself, to be a responsible decision maker, I don't think that's sort of exclusive to one particular culture. I think all cultures would embrace the idea of being a responsible decision maker, but I'm very open to being told I'm wrong about that.
Okay. Yeah, and there was another question about whether first, yeah, just a minor point, but quite a good one. Looking at that circle, it seemed, maybe this is culturally determined, it seemed a little illogical or surprising, at least, that the sequence went anti-clockwise. It might make more sense if those
yes, that's my bad graphic skills, Alan, because I don't think that's I think the Castle version looks different. It's because I wanted the responsible decision making at the top, and then I just spent far too much time fiddling with the other bits. But yeah, they should probably be in that is literally the only reason. It's my poor graphic manipulation skills.
And a question about the use of the terms real world and authentic. And the point was made that these are not necessarily the same thing, and that it suggested the need to, while there's clearly a value in using authentic material, but the need to adapt it for level. That, you know, perhaps things need very sensitive simplification, which is a kind of delicate operation if you don't want to lose the essence of a text, but simply taking on board authentic materials because they're authentic may actually not be the best way to broaden the scope of the material.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that 90% of the material that's in course books is not going to be authentic. It's going to be adapted at some point. So it's definitely real world, probably not authentic. There are instances of very interesting use of authentic language that could be appropriately used. There's I don't know if you've come across Bruno Leys, who sometimes he talks quite a lot about using very real examples of grammar and takes photographs of different grammar that's used in street signs and things like that, which is really, really interesting. But, you know, if you're dealing with a level that's lower than C1, inevitably, it's not going to be authentic. Again, I wonder what Hugh would say about that.
I have a real issue with the whole construct of authentic. Back in 1980, Henry Widdowson wrote a great article about the fact that what's called authentic material isn't authentic for the language classroom. A Guardian article is authentic for readers of The Guardian in a particular socio-cultural environment. A YouTube video aimed at a particular audience is authentic for the audience that it's aimed at. A text written for pre-intermediate language learners in a particular country or context or environment is authentic for those students. And Widdowson had this idea that actually what happens in the classroom, irrespective of where the text originally comes from, either the text is authenticated by the students and the teacher, or it's not. Okay, and that can be whether it's taken from a TV series or a real life listening or a course book or whatever. And that what authenticates the material is the way in which the teachers and the students respond to it, the discussions it prompts, the language that emerges from it. And if discussions come out of it and language comes out of it and there's meaningful interaction around it, that's authenticating the text that's there, regardless of whether it's written specifically for the students or written specifically for some other kind of audience. And so I think the problem with words like authentic is it makes it sound like course book texts are inauthentic. Well, they're not, that they're authentic for students learning language in a particular context. And, you know, they're authentically written for those students in that context. And so it's what then happens in the classroom that's really important in order to make it authentic. I think the real world thing's also problematic because the classroom is still the real world. You know, when you're in class, you are in the real world. You're not in Second Life or some imaginary, it's not a dream. You know, you're actually there. You're really there in the real classroom with real people talking about real things. And so I think they're kind of judgment words which don't help massively for us to think about what it is we're doing and what's going on. So I don't like the whole terminology around it personally. I much prefer the idea of things being authenticated through the interaction that occurs in the classroom, or not being authenticated. And I mean, I say this as someone who in my youth, I took in loads of so-called authentic material only for it to fall completely flat in the classroom because students had no interest in it. The grading was wrong. The topic was wrong. There was too much cultural stuff that they couldn't unpack. And, you know, I've taken in texts that I've written myself that are inauthentic or that other people have written that are inauthentic, that work really well in the classroom because they're written for the classroom, you know. So I don't find the whole discussion around authentic particularly useful personally. Controversial opinion for the day.
Torsten, any reflection on that? Thinking about some of the texts that you demonstrated from the books you'd focused on, because they, as far as I could tell, those texts had either been created by textbook writers, or they had been quite heavily simplified.
I completely agree with Yu's point that the label authentic, and for whom an authentic text is relevant, that might work. I completely agree with that. The examples we saw, I think, are like either fully constructed for the purpose of being in a course book. For example, the Jamaican context with the youth counselor who's giving advice via a blog, that's completely made up, but might still work because it's a blog and students in year 9 might like that sort of text. So even an inauthentic text could be authenticated. The last example with the very complex and balanced representation, I think this has a lot of links to the real world, because the community center that was addressed exists. Maybe not the person that was photographed and on the page, that person might not exist in reality as that person. But the cultural references, they make sense because they are real and they are not made up. And sometimes it could be like a mixture, like semi-authentic, to stay with the old terminology. And even if you bring in like an authentic text, I worked with LGBTIQ teenagers' biographies, autobiographies that they share online, like in a interview-like style, like 1 or 2 A4 pages. And even if you bring in this like super authentic text because it's original into a course book, you would still need to have tasks around it, like pre-while post and listening comprehension, reading comprehension, which could make it either inauthentic or even more authentic for the learning purpose, depending on your definition of authenticity. But in my experience, it's a big challenge to bring in like what could count as the right text. And either it's completely artificial and might do a great job, or it's completely from the real world and might do no good job because no one understands text. So it's the same complexity in that relationship that you described.
I think the fact that you feel forced to put scare quotes around the word authentic every time you use it speaks for itself.
Yeah, but
Alan, have you? I wonder if you've come across DLA Digital Learning Associates, because I did a bit of work with them. That was very interesting. They produce videos for various different publishers, and they work a lot with real life authentic bloggers who cover a whole range of subjects, including LGBTQIQ issues, along with lots of other issues. And what they do is they take them through a kind of mentorship program where they talk to them about how they can level their language, how they can talk in a way that's appropriate for a B1 learner or for an A2 learner, but then ultimately these people produce their own content. So it's a really interesting mix of authentic and not authentic, but these are real people talking about their real experiences all around the world. And I think that's a very interesting thing to explore.
And they're guided in ways of grading their language.
That's my understanding, yes. I'd love to find out more about how the mentorship program works, but yes, I think it's in terms of grading their language. But you know, the one that I saw was very interesting, and it was about a trans woman talking about how she'd learned to apply makeup and how she'd learned to sort of, you know, come to terms with the changes that she wanted to make to herself. So you know, it was a subject that would be difficult to include in many course books. But it wasn't a fake person; it was a real person. She was talking about her own life.
And are these kind of published online by DLA, or are they?
Yes. What are they called? Run. I cannot remember what they're called, run. Anyway, look, if you look at Digital Learning Associates, and I think they supply videos to quite a few publishers, but it's very, very interesting material. And it's just an interesting way of thinking about a way forward.
Dave Allen has put in the chat box some information or a link to the Palm project, which he describes as having got learners from a range of different language and cultural contexts to produce texts, including listening texts and videos reflecting their reality. So learner-generated texts from that project.
Can I just add one thing about the whole idea of kind of representation and stuff? Because I think I've just seen the comment from Dr. Nermin Mohammed, and I was thinking about the way in which, from a Western point of view, it's often easy to kind of focus on the fact that there's a dearth of representation of like LGBT characters and stuff in course books, which is obviously true. And personally, I think it's a big issue. At the same time, I think we also do need to recognize that there are all kinds of other voices which are also left out. I mean, I did a video the other day with one of my classes of women who wear the full niqab, talking about why they wear the niqab. Okay. And I'm not working with Muslim teachers, but there was a discussion came up about why do they wear those things? It's like, well, why don't you listen to the voices of people who wear them and find out why they wear them and hear their stories? And I think actually, I mean, people of faith are often also excluded from course books, in the same way as you don't get like gay couples, you don't get women who wear the full veil talking about their own religious feelings. You basically almost don't get anyone talking about religion in course books. You don't get people talking about what they believe and why their faith is important to them. And I think it's important to recognize that there's a whole load of other kinds of exclusions out there, apart from just kind of, the most obvious ones that we often talk about within the kind of Westocentric ELT community. And, in an ideal world, you'd have these voices coexisting and would be able to sort of sit and listen and talk to each other and think about each other's points of view and, try to find some common ground sometimes. So I think it's just a good thing to recognize there are other voices that we could also maybe listen to sometimes and learn from. Broader representation all round.
I think that's
within limits.
That's a really good note to end on. Thank you very much, Hugh. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kath. Thank you, Enno. Thank you, Torsten. And thank you, Hugh.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sarah, have you got some closing remarks?
I just wanted to say a big thank you to all of our presenters who've been a pleasure to work with, and I hope our audience has had a very stimulating and rewarding afternoon. And one of the thoughts I just wanted to end on was that quite often after afternoons like this, which make us think, which make people think about links that they've got and put them in the chat box, and then we go away and don't revisit. And so I guess I just want to say, if anybody wants to continue questions with any of our presenters, or get in touch with any of the work that they've been doing in the areas that we've been talking about, then please do. It would be great to hear from you and continue this. So yeah, thank you everybody for staying with us on this long winter's afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.